They said weakness was a disease in Dravenmoor, that the broken belonged in gutters, not palaces, that a girl with scars instead of jewels could never stand beside a king. But here's what the Empire forgot. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone with nothing left to lose is give them something worth protecting. This is the story of how a ghost became a queen and how an Alpha King burned the world for a girl everyone called worthless. Stay until the end because this gets wild. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is watching. The infirmary smelled like copper and desperation. Evelyne Rowe worked in silence, her fingers raw from scrubbing blood off surgical blades that had carved through flesh just hours before. The water in her basin ran pink, then red, then pink again as she cleaned each instrument with mechanical precision. Her gray dress hung loose on her thin frame. Fabric worn so many times the original color had faded into something between ash and memory. Nobody looked at her. Not the physician organizing herb pouches near the stone fireplace. Not the senior attendant restocking bandages. Not even the injured soldier groaning on the far cot while poison worked its way through his veins. She existed the way shadows exist. Present but ignored. Necessary but disposable. The servants called her Ghost Girl, though none of them remembered exactly when she'd arrived. One winter morning, she'd simply been there among the lower staff, carrying bruises that bloomed purple across her collarbone and wrists like terrible flowers. She never explained them, never complained, never asked for anything except the corner workspace where light from the barred window fell across her cleaning station. 3 years she'd worked in Blackmere Palace without anyone important learning her name. That was how she preferred it. Invisibility meant safety. Silence meant survival. She'd learned that lesson young, learned it in places where screaming only brought worse things crawling out of the dark. The door crashed open. Evelyne flinched, knocking a scalpel off her workbench. It clattered against stone as guards in black ceremonial armor swept into the infirmary like a violent wind. Their boots struck the floor with synchronized thunder. Wolf fur lined their shoulders. Silver crowned their helmets. The Royal Guard, which meant someone important was dying. Physician Garrett immediately straightened, wiping blood from his hands onto his apron. 2 more guards entered, carrying a stretcher between them. The man on it wore expensive riding leathers torn open across the chest, revealing a wound that wept crimson across his ribs. Lord Varen, some minor duke from the Northern Territories, got drunk. Challenged another noble to a duel, lost badly, standard nobility nonsense. What wasn't standard was who followed the stretcher into the infirmary. King Lucien Veydrake filled the doorway like gathered thunder. Evelyne forgot how to breathe. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone in the palace had glimpsed the Iron King during court assemblies or military processions, but always from a distance, always through crowds, always as something monumental and untouchable, like watching a storm from behind thick glass. Up close, he was terrifying. Not because of his size, though he stood taller than his guards and wore muscle the way weapons wear steel. Not because of the black military coat lined with wolf fur that swept nearly to his boots. Not even because of the crown of silver thorns that circled dark hair the color of midnight. Terrifying because his eyes missed nothing. Golden eyes that moved across the infirmary with predator focus, cataloging every detail, every person, every potential threat before dismissing them as irrelevant. When that gaze swept over Evelyne, she stopped existing. Just another piece of furniture. Just another shadow. Good. The king moved toward the injured duke without acknowledging anyone else in the room. His presence sucked the air out of the space. Physician Garrett stammered something about doing everything possible while guards positioned themselves at every exit. Evelyne kept her head down and returned to scrubbing surgical tools. Don't be seen. Don't be remembered. Don't matter. The mantra had kept her alive for years. Lord Varen screamed as the physician poured alcohol across his open chest. The smell of spirits mixed with blood and infection. Garrett worked quickly, hands steady despite the royal audience watching his every movement. King Lucien stood 3 feet from the operating table with his arms crossed, expression carved from granite. If he felt anything watching a man nearly die from stupidity, it didn't show on his face. That was what made him the Iron King. He felt nothing, or had trained himself so thoroughly to feel nothing that the difference no longer mattered. Evelyne understood that better than most people realized. She'd spent years learning to hollow herself out, to become a vessel without opinions or desires or complaints. Emptiness hurt less than hope. The king spoke suddenly, voice low and sharp. Will he live? Physician Garrett didn't look up from his stitching. If infection doesn't take him, yes. But he'll carry the scar. Good. Maybe it'll teach him not to duel while drunk. No sympathy, no concern, just cold assessment of whether a resource would continue being useful. That was how rulers survived, by treating people like chess pieces instead of humans. Evelyne knew that game too. She'd been a discarded pawn long before arriving at Blackmere Palace. The physician continued working while guards maintained their silent vigil, and King Lucien watched with the patience of something that had seen too much death to be disturbed by more of it. Minutes crawled past. The only sounds were Lord Varen's occasional whimpers and the wet slide of needle through skin. Then Evelyne made a mistake. She dropped the basin. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small slip of soapy fingers. But the metal basin hit stone with a sharp clang that echoed through the tense silence like a gunshot. Every head turned toward her, including the king's. Those golden eyes locked onto her with the focus of something deciding whether she was prey. Evelyne froze, hands still outstretched where the basin had fallen. Water spread across the floor in a dark puddle that reflected firelight. She waited for the punishment, for the shouting, for hands striking her the way hands always struck servants who disrupted important moments. But King Lucien just looked at her. Really looked. His gaze moved across her face like he was cataloging something unexpected. The angle of her jaw, the hollow of her cheeks, the way she held herself like someone perpetually apologizing for existing, the bruise on her wrist where the senior attendant had grabbed her too hard yesterday. Something flickered behind those golden eyes. Something dangerous. Then he looked away, dismissed her, returned his attention to the dying duke. Evelyne exhaled slowly and bent to retrieve the basin with shaking hands. The moment passed. She became invisible again, except she could still feel the weight of that gaze like a brand against her skin. Nobody had looked at her like that in years, like she was real. Bunk. The winter banquet arrived 3 weeks later with all the violence of empire on display. The grand ballroom drowned in gold and crystal, and enough candlelight to make the whole palace look like it was burning from the inside. Nobles wore their wealth like armor, dripping with jewels that cost more than entire villages. Music poured from the orchestra pit in waves of strings and brass. Servants moved through the crowd carrying trays of wine and delicacies, while guards in ceremonial dress lined the marble walls. Evelyne worked the edges of the room, invisible as always. Her job tonight was simple. Refill wine glasses, clear empty plates, disappear when nobles wanted privacy for their political scheming. She'd perfected the art of vanishing while standing in plain sight. The ballroom was a theater of cruelty disguised as celebration. She'd learned to read the patterns. Which nobles were forming alliances? Which families were fracturing under financial pressure? Which women were being traded like livestock through marriage contracts? The empire called it civilization. Evelyne called it a prettier version of the labor camps she'd escaped. Different cages, same bars. She moved through the crowd with a tray of crystal glasses, offering wine to a cluster of ladies, wearing enough silk to clothe a dozen families. They took the glasses without looking at her, without acknowledging her existence. She was furniture that happened to move. Good. Invisibility was safety. Until Duke Morven grabbed her arm. The man was drunk, swaying slightly as his fingers dug into her wrist hard enough to bruise. He'd been drinking since the banquet started, working his way through enough wine to kill his sense of discretion along with his balance. "You," he slurred, breath reeking of spirits and expensive tobacco. "Bring me more wine." Evelyne kept her voice quiet. "Yes, my lord." She tried to pull away gently, his grip tightened. "I said bring me wine, girl. Are you deaf?" Other nobles were starting to notice, starting to watch with the casual interest of people observing something mildly entertaining. Evelyne's heart hammered against her ribs. "My lord, I need my arm to carry the tray." Duke Morven struck her, not with his fist, just an open-handed slap hard enough to snap her head sideways and send the tray of wine glasses flying across the marble floor. Crystal exploded. Wine splashed across polished stone in dark red puddles that looked like blood. The music didn't stop. The nobles didn't gasp. Nobody reacted at all. Because servants getting hit was normal, expected, part of the natural order of things. Evelyne tasted copper. Her lip had split. Blood ran down her chin and dripped onto her gray dress, adding another stain to the collection she'd accumulated over years of this. Duke Morven laughed. Clumsy bitch. She knelt immediately, hands already reaching for broken glass while her vision swam. Apologies formed on her tongue by instinct, the same apologies she'd learned to speak before anyone demanded them. I'm sorry. I'm worthless and I'm sorry. That was when the music stopped. Not gradually, not politely. The orchestra fell silent mid-note like someone had cut all their strings simultaneously. The entire ballroom froze. Evelyne looked up from the broken glass and spilled wine and saw something that turned her blood cold. King Lucien Veydrake was standing. He'd risen from the throne platform at the far end of the ballroom, and now every noble in the empire was watching him with expressions caught between fear and fascination. The Iron King descended the marble steps slowly, each footfall echoing through the terrible silence. He wore black formal attire edged in gold, the crown of silver thorns catching candlelight. His face showed nothing. No anger, no emotion, which somehow made him more terrifying. He walked through the crowd like something inevitable. Nobles parted before him, the way water parts before the prow of a warship. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. King Lucien stopped beside Evelyne. She knelt on the floor, surrounded by broken glass, and spilled wine, while blood dripped from her split lip onto marble that cost more than her entire existence. The king looked down at her. Then he did something that shattered every rule of imperial hierarchy. He knelt. Not fully. Just enough to bring himself closer to her level, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, close enough to smell leather and steel and something darker underneath. His hand moved. Evelyne flinched, but he didn't strike her. His fingers touched her chin gently, tilting her face up toward the candlelight, toward him. His thumb brushed across her split lip with careful pressure. The entire ballroom held its breath. When King Lucien spoke, his voice carried through the silence like a blade drawn from a sheath. What is your name? The question broke something inside her chest, because nobody important had ever cared enough to ask. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Tried again, failed. Blood from her lips stained his thumb, but he didn't pull away. Your name, he repeated, quieter this time. Patient. Evelyne, she whispered. Evelyne Rowe. Evelyne. He tested the sound of it. Then his gaze shifted to Duke Morven, who'd gone pale as bleached bone. You struck her. It wasn't a question. Duke Morven stammered. Your Majesty, she's just a servant. I didn't ask what she was. I said you struck her. She dropped the wine. She dropped wine because you grabbed her hard enough to bruise her wrist. I watched you do it. The Duke's face cycled through emotions. Confusion. Indignation. Then growing terror as he realized the king wasn't asking for an explanation. He was deciding a punishment. King Lucien stood, pulling Evelyne up with him. His hand stayed on her arm, steadying her, supporting her. Every noble in the ballroom stared at them with expressions of shock. The Iron King supporting a servant girl, touching her like she mattered. It violated every social law the empire had built itself on. Tell me something, Morven. The king's voice stayed quiet, conversational. What do you think happens to men who damage things that belong to me? Your Majesty, I didn't know. You didn't know she was mine? She works in my palace, serves under my roof, breathes air I allow her to breathe. Golden eyes narrowed. Everything in this empire belongs to me. Every servant, every soldier, every noble. He paused. Every duke. Duke Morven dropped to his knees so fast it looked like his legs had been cut out from under him. Forgive me, Your Majesty. Please, I meant no disrespect. You meant exactly the disrespect you showed. You just didn't expect consequences. King Lucien looked at the guards lining the walls. Remove him. 3 months in the southern barracks. Hard labor. No servants. No privileges. He can remember what it feels like to be treated like something disposable. Guards moved immediately, hauling the protesting duke toward the exit while he begged and pleaded and promised it would never happen again. The king didn't watch him go. He was still looking at Evelyne. The entire ballroom watched as King Lucien Veydrake, the most powerful man in the empire, lifted a servant girl's hand and examined the bruises darkening her wrist. Who did this? Evelyne couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't how the world worked. Kings didn't notice servants, didn't care about bruises, didn't punish nobles for doing what nobles had always done. Who? He asked again. It doesn't matter, she whispered. It matters to me. And the way he said it made her believe him, which was more terrifying than anything else that had happened tonight. Because hope was dangerous. Hope got you killed. King Lucien released her hand carefully, like she was made of something fragile. Then he turned to face the assembled nobility with an expression that could have frozen blood. Let me be clear about something. His voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. Any person in this palace who strikes a servant without cause answers to me personally. Any noble who treats the staff like disposable objects will learn what it feels like to be treated the same way. This ends tonight. Silence. Am I understood? A chorus of yes. Your Majesty rippled through the crowd. The king's gaze swept across them with obvious contempt. Then he looked back at Evelyne. Come with me. It wasn't a request. Evelyne followed him through the frozen ballroom while hundreds of nobles watched in stunned silence. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why the Iron King cared about a servant girl with bruises and a split lip and nothing worth protecting, but she followed him anyway. Because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her like she was real. And that was worth whatever came next. Hautes. The king's private study existed in a part of the palace Evelyne had never entered. Guards opened massive oak doors carved with battle scenes, revealing a chamber that smelled like leather and old paper and wood smoke. Shelves lined every wall, packed with books and maps and correspondence from territories across the empire. A fireplace large enough to stand in burned at the far end. Heavy furniture dominated the space, all dark wood and iron fixtures. This was where the empire was actually ruled, not in throne rooms or council chambers. Here, in the quiet. In the dark. King Lucien closed the door behind them, leaving the guards outside. The lock clicked with heavy finality. They were alone. Evelyne stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for whatever came next. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but she could still taste copper. The bruises on her wrist throbbed in time with her pulse. The king moved to a cabinet near the fireplace and pulled out a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. He poured 2 glasses without asking if she wanted one. Then he handed her a glass. She took it because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting. The crystal felt expensive in her damaged hands. King Lucien leaned against his desk, studying her over the rim of his own glass. Firelight caught the gold in his eyes and turned them molten. Drink, he said. Evelyne took a small sip. Whatever was in the glass burned down her throat like liquid fire. Expensive whiskey, probably. The kind that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. She didn't cough, didn't react, just lowered the glass and waited. The king smiled slightly. Most people choke on their first taste of Veydrake Reserve. I've had worse things in my mouth, Your Majesty. The words came out before she could stop them, honest and raw and completely inappropriate for addressing royalty. She waited for him to get angry. Instead, he laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A real laugh that transformed his entire face from stone into something almost human. I don't doubt that. He took another drink, still watching her. How long have you worked in my palace? 3 years, Your Majesty. And in 3 years, nobody has bothered learning your name. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. No, Your Majesty. But they've had no problem leaving bruises on you. Silence. King Lucien set his glass down and moved toward her with that same predator grace. Evelyne forced herself not to retreat, forced herself to stay still, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. He stopped inches away. This close, she could see the scars hidden beneath his formal clothes, could smell leather and steel and something darker, could feel the heat radiating off him like he was burning from the inside. Show me, he said quietly. Your Majesty, show me everywhere they've hurt you. The request froze her completely, because nobody had ever asked before. Nobody had ever cared. The bruises had always been her private shame, evidence of her worthlessness that she carried alone. Her voice cracked. Why? Because I want to know exactly how many people I need to destroy. He said it simply, factually, like describing the weather. And Evelyne realized with sudden, terrible clarity that he meant it. The Iron King wasn't asking out of pity. He was cataloging targets. Her hand shook as she set the whiskey glass on the nearest surface. Then slowly, carefully, she pulled back the sleeve of her gray dress to reveal the bruises marking her wrist and forearm. Dark purple blotches in the shape of fingers, evidence of being grabbed, held, hurt. The king's jaw tightened. "More," he said. She hesitated, then turned slightly and indicated the bruises along her ribs where someone had kicked her last month for dropping a basket of linens. King Lucien's expression went perfectly blank, which was worse than anger. "Anyone else touches you," he said quietly, "you tell me their name immediately. Do you understand?" "Your Majesty, you're mine." The words came out hard and final. "Every person in this palace belongs to me, but you especially. You're under my protection now. That means anyone who hurts you is committing treason." Evelyne couldn't breathe. Protection. Nobody had protected her since her father died. Nobody had stood between her and the world's cruelty. And now the most dangerous man in the empire was claiming her like territory. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. "Why do you care?" King Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Firelight played across his features, highlighting the brutal beauty of him. "Because I recognize starvation when I see it," he said finally. "Not hunger for food, hunger for worth, for mattering, for being seen as human instead of furniture." His golden eyes held hers. "I was raised inside a different kind of cruelty, Evelyne. Kings aren't loved as sons. We're trained as weapons, shaped into something useful and terrible." He moved closer. "But I remember what it felt like to be treated like I didn't matter, to be valued only for what I could become, not what I was. They beat the softness out of me piece by piece until all that remained was the blade they wanted." Something ancient and damaged flickered behind his eyes. "I see the same marks on you, different scars, same wound. The world tried to erase you, and you survived anyway." He paused. "That makes you extraordinary." Evelyne felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I'm not extraordinary, Your Majesty. I'm just broken." "We're all broken." His hand lifted, fingers ghosting along her jaw with impossible gentleness. "The question is what we do with the pieces." The moment stretched between them, heavy with something neither of them had words for. Then King Lucien stepped back, breaking the spell. "You'll move to the eastern wing tomorrow. Private quarters. Better conditions. I'm assigning you to the Royal Greenhouse Restoration Project." Evelyne blinked. "The greenhouse? You studied medicinal plants. I saw the books in your workspace." At her shocked expression, he smiled slightly. "I notice more than people think. The Eastern Greenhouse has been abandoned for years. You'll oversee its restoration. Full access to my personal library, whatever resources you need." "Your Majesty, I don't understand, but you don't have to understand. You just have to accept." His voice softened. "You've spent years surviving. Let me teach you how to live instead." The offer hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Evelyne looked at the Iron King and saw something she'd never expected. Kindness. Real kindness. Not the performative charity nobles showed to make themselves feel virtuous. He was offering her a life. A real life. After years of just surviving. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Lucien," he corrected her gently. "When we're alone, call me Lucien." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyne felt something besides emptiness crack open inside her chest. It felt terrifyingly close to hope. Bursham, 3 months later. The royal court had become a battlefield. Evelyne moved through it like someone learning to navigate a minefield blindfolded. Every conversation was a trap. Every smile hid knives. Every piece of gossip was ammunition being stockpiled for future wars. The Eastern Wing quarters had been a gift. Privacy. Safety. A room with actual windows and a door that locked from the inside. The Greenhouse Restoration Project had given her purpose, filled her days with something besides survival. But it had also painted a target on her back. Because the nobility couldn't understand why the Iron King cared about a servant girl with no family name, no wealth, no connections worth mentioning. They whispered theories in corridors and drawing rooms. Some called her his newest obsession. Others claimed she was a spy. A few suggested darker possibilities. The truth was simpler and somehow more dangerous. King Lucien treated her like she mattered. He pulled her into war councils to ask her opinion on supply routes for medical provisions. Walked with her through the palace gardens while discussing everything from philosophy to combat strategy. Spent evenings in the library teaching her about territorial politics and the delicate balance of power that kept the empire from tearing itself apart. He listened when she spoke, remembered details nobody else bothered learning, asked her thoughts on matters of state like her perspective held actual value. And that terrified the court more than any military conquest ever could, because kings weren't supposed to value damaged things. Lady Callista Mourningvale sat in the solar surrounded by her carefully curated circle of noble ladies, each one dressed in silk that cost enough to feed a village for months. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting them all in colors that made them look like jeweled insects. Beautiful and venomous. Callista was the daughter of High Chancellor Mourningvale, a woman who'd been groomed since birth to marry power and produce heirs that would secure her family's legacy for generations. She understood influence, manipulation, the subtle art of political seduction. She'd spent years positioning herself as the obvious choice for queen. Then a broken servant girl had ruined everything. "It's unnatural," Lady Thorne was saying, her voice sharp with indignation. "The king treats her like she's important." "She's a servant," another woman added. "Less than that. A foundling with no family name, no breeding, nothing worth protecting." Callista sipped her tea with practiced grace. "The king has always had unconventional tastes. Unconventional is collecting art from foreign territories." Lady Thorne leaned forward. "This is insanity. He gave her the Eastern Greenhouse, private quarters, access to the Royal Library. He consults her on matters of state." "Perhaps he sees something we don't," Callista said carefully. "What could he possibly see? She's damaged goods. Broken. Used." Lady Thorne's voice dropped to a vicious whisper. "I heard she came from the northern labor camps, that she was trafficked before escaping to the capital." The room fell silent. Because if that was true, it made everything worse. Labor camps were where the empire sent criminals, debtors, and anyone else who'd failed to maintain their value to society. They were brutal places where human life meant less than the resources being extracted. Nobody survived labor camps intact, and nobody who'd been through one belonged anywhere near a throne. Callista set her teacup down with careful precision. "We need to verify that information. And if it's true, then we expose her for what she really is, not the king's newest obsession, just another broken thing trying to climb above her station." The ladies nodded in agreement, already planning their attack. What none of them understood was that King Lucien Veydrake had never cared about perfection. He cared about survival. And Evelyne Rowe had survived things that would have destroyed everyone in that solar. That was what made her dangerous. Yang. The Winter Tribunal assembled in the Grand Cathedral 3 weeks later. The entire royal court gathered beneath vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that threw colored light across marble floors. Nobles filled the pews in order of rank and importance. Council members sat in elevated positions near the altar. Guards lined every wall. And at the center of it all, King Lucien sat on the throne of judgment, wearing his crown and formal armor like a warning. Evelyne stood in the witness position near the front, her hands clasped together to hide their shaking. She wore a simple dress in deep blue that the king had commissioned for her, better than anything she'd owned but still modest compared to the silk and jewels surrounding her. She didn't understand why she'd been summoned to the tribunal, only that Lucien had told her this morning to trust him. No matter what happened, trust him. High Chancellor Mourningvale stood from his seat, the motion drawing every eye in the cathedral. He was an older man with silver hair and the kind of face that looked dignified even when delivering cruelty. "Your Majesty," he began, voice carrying through the space with practiced authority, "we are gathered today to address a matter of grave concern to the security and integrity of this empire." King Lucien's expression revealed nothing. "Proceed." The Chancellor gestured toward Evelyne. "This woman has been granted unprecedented access to the royal court, to military councils, to matters of state security, all without proper vetting or investigation into her background. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobility. She has claimed to be nothing more than a servant with no family ties, the Chancellor continued, but recent investigation has revealed discrepancies. Evelyne's blood went cold. No, please no. Lady Callista Morningvale stood from her seat, moving to join her father at the front of the cathedral. She looked radiant in emerald silk, every inch the perfect noble lady. She smiled at Evelyne like a knife sliding between ribs. We've discovered the truth about Miss Rowe's past, Your Majesty. Information she deliberately concealed when entering service at Blackmere Palace. King Lucien's voice stayed level. What information? 6 years ago, Evelyne Rowe's father died heavily in debt to Northern Territory lords. Unable to pay, her relatives sold her to the Ironhold labor camp to settle the account. Callista's words fell like hammer blows. She spent 3 years in Ironhold before escaping and making her way to the capital under a false name. The cathedral erupted. Nobles gasped, whispered, recoiled like she'd brought disease into their midst. Labor camps, trafficking, escaped criminal. Every word was a brand burning away any legitimacy she might have claimed. Evelyne stood frozen while her worst nightmare unfolded around her. This was why she'd never told anyone. Why she'd buried that part of herself so deep she sometimes forgot it existed. Because nobody wanted damaged goods. Nobody wanted someone the world had already thrown away. She's filth, someone whispered loud enough to carry. Diseased. A common survivor pretending to stand beside a king. The words crashed over her like waves, each one confirming what she'd always known. She didn't belong here. Would never belong anywhere that mattered. High Chancellor Morningvale's voice cut through the chaos. Your Majesty, this woman has been living in the royal wing under false pretenses. She has accessed confidential information while concealing a criminal past. By law, she should be arrested for fraud and deception. Evelyne couldn't breathe. This was it. The moment everything she'd tried to build came crashing down, she looked at King Lucien, expecting to see disgust. Disappointment. The same expression everyone wore when they learned the truth about what she'd been, what she still was. But Lucien was looking at the High Chancellor, and his expression was terrifying. Not rage. Rage would have been safer. This was something colder, sharper, the look of something deciding exactly how to destroy an enemy. The Iron King rose from his throne slowly, and the entire cathedral fell silent. He descended the marble steps wearing black armor edged in gold, the crown of silver thorns catching light from the stained glass windows. Every footfall echoed through the terrible quiet. He stopped beside Evelyne, then did something that shattered the Empire's foundations. He removed his crown. The collective gasp could have extinguished every candle in the cathedral. King Lucien held the crown in both hands, looking at it like it was just metal and gems instead of the symbol of absolute power. Then he turned to face the assembled nobility. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the space. You call her worthless because the world hurt her. Each word fell like a judge's verdict. You worship people born in silk while mocking those who survived chains. You mistake suffering for weakness because none of you would have lasted 3 days in the places she endured for 3 years. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This empire crowns predators while discarding survivors. You celebrate men who conquer through violence while condemning women who survive through strength, and you wonder why kingdoms rot from the inside. His golden eyes swept across the horrified nobility like he was cataloging exactly who would need to be eliminated later. Evelyne Rowe survived a labor camp, escaped trafficking, built herself back from nothing while carrying scars that would have broken every person in this cathedral. He paused. That doesn't make her worthless. That makes her more valuable than any of you. Then King Lucien did the unthinkable. He placed the royal crown on Evelyne's head, not as coronation, as judgment. The crown was heavy, too heavy. She could feel it settling onto her hair with all the weight of empire. If the world threw her away, Lucien said quietly, his voice nonetheless carrying to every corner of the cathedral, then the world is a fool, and I have no patience for fools. The silence that followed was absolute, because every noble in that cathedral understood what they were witnessing. The Iron King had just declared war on anyone who threatened her, and men like Lucien Veydrake burned kingdoms for things they loved. Evelyne looked up at him through the weight of a crown she'd never asked for, in a world that had never wanted her, and saw something that terrified her more than any punishment. He meant it, every word. He would destroy the Empire itself before letting them take her down. High Chancellor Morningvale stood frozen, his carefully constructed attack collapsing around him. Lady Callista had gone pale as bone, because they'd made a tactical error. They'd assumed the king's interest was temporary, controllable. They'd forgotten that alpha rulers didn't do anything halfway. King Lucien turned back to the tribunal, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the promise of violence. Let me be very clear about something. Evelyne Rowe is under my protection. Anyone who moves against her moves against me. Anyone who spreads rumors about her will answer to me personally, and anyone who thinks her past makes her weak will learn exactly how wrong they are. He smiled. It looked like a wolf baring its teeth. Tribunal dismissed. The cathedral emptied in chaos, nobles fleeing like rats from a burning ship. Within minutes, only the guards remained, standing at attention along the walls. King Lucien gently lifted the crown from Evelyne's head and set it aside. Then he took her face in both hands. "You're shaking," he said quietly. "They hate me." Her voice broke on the words. "Everyone hates me. Let them." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones. "Their hatred means nothing. Their opinions mean nothing. You survived things they can't even imagine. That's worth more than their approval ever will be." "But no." The word came out firm, final. "You don't get to diminish yourself anymore. Not here. Not with me." Evelyne looked up at him through tears she couldn't stop and saw the truth written in golden eyes. He wasn't protecting her out of pity. He was protecting her because he recognized the same damage in her that lived inside himself. Two survivors shaped by different cruelties, both still standing. "What happens now?" she whispered. King Lucien's expression went dark. "Now," he said quietly, "I teach the Empire what happens when people threaten things that belong to me." And somewhere deep in the palace, in rooms where nobles plotted their revenge, they had no idea what they'd just unleashed, because the court had wanted to break her. Instead, they'd turned her into the one thing more dangerous than an Alpha King, a cause worth dying for. But that war would have to wait. Tonight, Evelyne Rowe stood in an empty cathedral beside a king who'd chosen her over the approval of an entire empire, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. The days following the tribunal felt like waiting for an execution. Evelyne moved through the palace like someone walking across ice too thin to trust. Every corridor felt dangerous. Every glance from passing nobles carried weight. The servants who'd once ignored her now watched with expressions caught between fear and fascination. She'd become something impossible to categorize. Not quite servant, not quite nobility, just a broken girl standing in the shadow of a king who declared war on anyone who touched her. The eastern greenhouse became her refuge. She spent mornings there alone, surrounded by glass walls and the sharp green smell of growing things. Herbs and medicinal plants filled the renovated space, lavender and sage, rosemary and thyme, things that healed instead of hurt. Her hands worked soil while her mind tried to process what had happened in the cathedral. King Lucien had placed a crown on her head, not as coronation, as statement. "This woman matters. Anyone who disagrees can face me directly." The memory made her hands shake so badly she had to stop working and just breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd learned to control panic during the worst nights in Ironhold labor camp, because this felt like those nights, waiting for punishment that hadn't arrived yet, knowing it was coming. The door opened behind her. Evelyne turned, expecting a servant or perhaps one of the guards assigned to watch her quarters. Instead, Lady Callista Morningvale stood in the doorway wearing pale pink silk and a smile that looked like it had been carved with a razor. Every muscle in Evelyne's body went tight. Callista closed the door gently behind her, the lock clicking with soft finality. Then she moved through the greenhouse with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent their entire life performing for audiences. She stopped 3 feet away, examining a cluster of lavender like it was the most interesting thing in the room. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of casual cruelty only nobility could perfect. "You know what I find fascinating about gardens? How they require constant maintenance. Pull one weed and 3 more appear. Neglect them for even a season, and everything beautiful gets choked out by invasive species. Evelyne stayed silent. Callista plucked a lavender stem, crushing it between manicured fingers. The scent filled the space between them. The king thinks you're special, that your survival makes you valuable. She looked up, meeting Evelyne's eyes with crystalline hatred. He doesn't understand that survival without breeding is just persistence, like cockroaches. Hard to kill, but ultimately worthless. I'm not having this conversation, Evelyne said quietly. Oh, but you are, because I need you to understand something. Callista moved closer, invading personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. This protection the king offers, it's temporary. Men like Lucien Veydrake get bored. They move on. And when he does, when he finally realizes you're just damaged goods playing dress-up in borrowed clothes, there won't be anyone left to protect you. Get out. Callista smiled wider. Make me. Go ahead. Strike a noble lady. See what happens when you don't have the Iron King standing beside you. The challenge hung in the air like poison, because they both knew the truth. Without Lucien's protection, Evelyne was nothing, less than nothing. A former labor camp survivor with scars and nightmares and no legitimate claim to anything resembling value. Callista leaned in close enough that Evelyne could smell expensive perfume, and underneath it, something sharper. Malice dressed up as refinement. You think he loves you? Her whisper carried venom. He's obsessed with fixing broken things. It makes him feel powerful, merciful. But obsession fades, girl. And when it does, you'll be right back where you started, cleaning blood off surgical tools while nobles step over you like garbage. She straightened, smoothing silk that didn't need smoothing. Enjoy the greenhouse while it lasts. Invasive species never survive winter. Then she was gone, leaving Evelyne alone among growing things with her heart hammering against her ribs. The worst part was knowing Callista might be right. Because why would a king choose her? Really choose her? She was everything the Empire taught people to despise. Broken, used, thrown away by her own blood. The door opened again. Evelyne spun, expecting Callista returning with reinforcements. King Lucien stood in the doorway, still wearing his military coat from the morning war council. Wolf fur lined his shoulders. Dried blood marked his knuckles. He'd been training or punishing someone. With him, the difference didn't always matter. His golden eyes swept the greenhouse, cataloging everything. The crushed lavender. Evelyne's white-knuckle grip on the workbench, the way she was breathing too fast. Who was here? His voice came out flat and dangerous. Nobody. Don't lie to me. The command struck her like a physical blow. Because he didn't ask, didn't suggest, just stated fact. Kings didn't request honesty. They demanded it. Lady Callista, Evelyne admitted quietly. She wanted to remind me that I don't belong here. Lucien went very still. The kind of stillness that preceded violence. What did she say? That you'll get bored. That obsession fades. That when you finally see me for what I really am, there won't be anyone left to protect me from what I deserve. Her voice broke on the last word. Because part of her believed it. Part of her had always believed she deserved every bad thing that happened. That suffering was just the natural consequence of being fundamentally worthless. King Lucien crossed the greenhouse in 3 strides. He didn't touch her gently this time. His hand caught her chin firmly, tilting her face up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. Listen to me very carefully. His voice stayed quiet, but carried an edge that could cut bone. You don't get to decide what you deserve. You don't get to believe they're poison just because they're good at delivering it. I'm not. You are. You're standing here questioning whether you belong because a noble bitch who's never suffered a day in her privileged life told you that survival without breeding is worthless. His thumb pressed against her jaw. Do you know what I see when I look at you? Someone broken. Someone who survived being broken. There's a difference. He leaned closer. Nobility is an accident of birth. Survival is a choice you make every single day in places designed to destroy you. One of those things is valuable. The other is just luck. His grip softened slightly but didn't release. Callista Morningvale was born into wealth and trained to manipulate power. She's never been tested. Never had to choose between dying and becoming something harder. You were forged in a labor camp and came out the other side still capable of gentleness, still able to care about wounded servants and medicinal plants and things that can't offer you anything in return. That's not weakness, Evelyne. That's strength they can't comprehend. The words hit her like blows to the chest, because nobody had ever said them before. Nobody had ever looked at her scars and seen anything besides damage. Why? The question came out broken. Why do you care this much? Something shifted behind his golden eyes. Something ancient and damaged. King Lucien released her chin but didn't step back. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight that felt like confession. I told you I was raised to be a weapon, that they beat the softness out of me until all that remained was something useful and terrible. He paused. What I didn't tell you is that I remember what it felt like. Being that child, wanting desperately for someone to see me as human instead of just a future king. His jaw tightened. Nobody did. Every kindness came with conditions. Every gesture of affection was training me for political manipulation. By the time I took the throne, I'd learned the lesson perfectly. Feel nothing, trust no one, treat people like resources to be managed. He looked at her with an expression that made her chest ache. Then I saw you kneeling on that ballroom floor, cleaning up wine while blood ran from your lip, and nobody reacted. Nobody cared. You were less than furniture to them, and I realized I'd become exactly what they wanted, cold enough to watch suffering and feel nothing. But I did feel something, rage, at them for treating you like garbage, at myself for building an empire where that treatment was normal. His hand lifted, fingers ghosting along her cheek. You make me remember what it felt like to be human, Evelyne. To care about something besides power and conquest and maintaining control. That terrifies me. Because caring creates weakness. Weakness creates death. But I can't stop. The confession hung between them like something fragile and impossible. Evelyne looked up at the most dangerous man in the empire and saw the truth written in his eyes. He wasn't protecting her out of obsession. He was protecting her because she reminded him of the parts of himself he thought had died years ago. Two damaged things recognizing each other across a ballroom. You're not obsessed with fixing me, she whispered. You're trying to save the part of yourself you think is already dead. Lucien's expression cracked slightly. Yes. And what happens when you realize I can't be saved, that I'm too broken to fix? His answer came without hesitation. Then we'll be broken together. The words shattered something inside her chest that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will. Because this wasn't some fairy tale where the prince saved the damaged girl and they lived happily ever after. This was two survivors clinging to each other in the dark, hoping their combined wreckage was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. Evelyne reached up slowly and placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. They're going to try to destroy me, she said quietly. The court. The nobles. Everyone who thinks I don't belong. I know. They'll use everything, my past, my scars, every terrible thing that's ever happened to me. I know. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. Let them try. I've burned kingdoms for less important reasons, and looking into golden eyes that held promises of violence, Evelyne believed him completely. The attacks began in earnest 3 days later. They came at her sideways, indirect. The kind of warfare nobility had perfected over centuries of political scheming. Poisoned rumors spread through the capital like plague. Servants whispered that Evelyne had bewitched the king using dark magic learned in the labor camps, that she was a spy planted by rival kingdoms, that she carried diseases from her time being trafficked. None of it was true. All of it was believed, because people wanted to believe it, needed a reason why the Iron King would choose damaged goods over perfection. The attacks escalated. Someone placed a dead rat in her greenhouse with a note tied around its neck. This is what happens to invasive species. Her quarters were searched while she attended a council meeting. Nothing stolen, just her belongings moved, disturbed, violated. A servant spat at her feet while she walked through the lower corridors. And through it all, King Lucien watched with the patience of something waiting for enemies to reveal themselves completely before striking. The Royal War Council assembled on a gray morning that threatened rain. Generals and territorial lords filled the chamber, standing around a massive table covered in maps and troop movements and correspondence from border territories. Evelyne sat in a chair near the fireplace, trying to be invisible. She shouldn't be here, War councils were for military commanders and noble advisors, not former labor camp survivors with no strategic training. But Lucien had insisted. "You understand supply chains and medical provisions better than most of these idiots," he'd said that morning. "Your opinion matters." So she sat quietly, while men who'd conquered nations discussed troop deployment and territorial expansion like they were moving chess pieces instead of human lives. General Kastov was mid-sentence about reinforcing the southern border when Lord Thorn interrupted. "Your Majesty, before we continue, I must address the security concern in this room." The chamber fell silent. King Lucien looked up from the maps with an expression that could freeze blood. "What security concern?" Lord Thorn gestured toward Evelyne like she was a visible stain on expensive furniture. "This woman has access to confidential military information despite having no security clearance, no background verification, and a documented history of criminal activity." Several lords nodded in agreement. Evelyne felt her stomach drop. Because this was different from the social attacks. This was questioning her presence in matters of state security, suggesting she was a threat to the empire itself. King Lucien set down the territorial correspondence he'd been reading. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of something deciding whether to kill quickly or slowly. "Are you questioning my judgment, Thorn?" The lord hesitated. "I'm questioning the wisdom of allowing someone with her background access to sensitive information." Her background. Lucien repeated the words like he was tasting poison. "You mean her survival of a labor camp and trafficking? Or are you referring to something else?" Lord Thorn's face reddened. "Your Majesty, surely you understand the security risk. What I understand is that you're using concerns about security to mask the fact that you're uncomfortable with her presence." His golden eyes swept across the assembled lords. "All of you are. She makes you nervous because she survived things that would have destroyed you, and that threatens your belief that nobility equals strength." Nobody spoke. Evelyne Rowe has more insight into supply chain vulnerabilities than anyone in this room. She understands how resources move through hostile territory because she's lived in those territories. She knows what soldiers actually need because she's treated their wounds. She sees problems you miss because you've never had to survive without privilege protecting you. He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "So when I ask her opinion on medical provisions or supply routes, it's not because I've lost my mind. It's because her perspective is worth more than your discomfort." Lord Thorn opened his mouth to respond. "Are we clear?" Lucien's voice dropped to something dangerous. The lord closed his mouth and nodded. "Good. Now, unless anyone else wants to question my decisions, we have a war to plan." The council continued, but the atmosphere had changed, shifted. Every lord in that room now understood that defending Evelyne was defending the king's authority. Attack her and you attacked him directly. But after the council dispersed and Evelyne walked back toward her quarters alone, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were getting worse instead of better. Because defending her was costing Lucien political capital, creating fractures in the court, turning allies into enemies. And eventually, he'd have to choose between protecting her and protecting his empire. She knew which one was more important. She was crossing through the portrait gallery when someone grabbed her from behind. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. Another arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She tried to fight, but her attacker was stronger, dragging her backward into one of the side chambers. The door slammed shut. Evelyne was thrown against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She scrambled backward, trying to focus through the pain. 3 men surrounded her wearing servants' clothing but moving like trained fighters. Not random violence, coordinated attack. The largest one stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade caught lamplight. "Nothing personal," he said flatly. "But you're bad for business. The nobility wants you gone. They're paying well to make it happen." Evelyne's mind raced. Nobody knew she was here. The guards were 2 corridors away. Even if she screamed, they wouldn't reach her in time. She was alone, just like always. The man moved closer, knife raised, and something inside Evelyne snapped. Not fear this time. Something harder. She'd survived 3 years in Ironhold labor camp, survived trafficking and abuse and every terrible thing the world could throw at someone. She'd been beaten and broken and discarded. But she was still standing. When the knife came down, she moved, not away, toward. The training Lucien had insisted she receive over the past months kicked in, blocked the wrist, step inside his reach, drive her knee up hard into his groin. The man doubled over with a choked scream. Evelyne grabbed the fallen knife and spun toward the other two attackers. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she held the blade steady. "Come on then," she said quietly. "Let's see what happens." The men hesitated because they'd expected a victim. Easy prey. A broken girl who'd collapse under pressure. Instead, they were facing someone who'd decided she was done being prey. The moment stretched. Then the door exploded inward. King Lucien entered like a force of nature, flanked by royal guards. His expression held no emotion, no rage, no surprise, just cold calculation. He looked at Evelyne holding the knife, at the three men surrounding her, at the blood already staining her sleeve where she'd been cut. When he spoke, his voice could have stripped flesh from bone. "Who sent you?" The men didn't answer. Lucien nodded to his guards. "Take them to the interrogation chambers. I want names. Everyone who financed this, everyone who knew about it, everyone who even thought about helping." He moved to Evelyne while guards dragged the attackers away. His hands were gentle as he took the knife from her shaking grip, careful as he examined the cut on her arm. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine." "You're not." His jaw tightened. "But you fought back." "That's good." "I didn't have a choice." "Yes, you did. You could have frozen, collapsed, let them finish it." He met her eyes. "You chose to fight instead. That matters." Evelyne started shaking harder, not from pain, from the realization of what had almost happened. "They were going to kill me." "I know. To get to you." His expression went dark. "Yes. This won't stop, will it? The attacks, the threats, they're going to keep coming until either I'm dead or you're destroyed politically." Lucien pulled her close, mindless of the blood staining her sleeve. "Let them come. I'll burn the empire to ash before I let them take you from me." And that was the problem, Evelyne realized, because he meant it. The Iron King would sacrifice everything for her. His political alliances, his council's support, the stability of the entire empire. All because a broken girl reminded him what it felt like to be human. That kind of devotion was terrifying. Because empires fell when kings valued one person over thousands. And somewhere deep in the palace, in rooms where nobles plotted their next move, they were counting on exactly that. Chess. The interrogation revealed what everyone already suspected. Lady Callista Morningvale had financed the assassination attempt. Her father, High Chancellor Morningvale, had provided the contacts. 3 other noble families had contributed funding. All of them wanted Evelyne dead. Not because she was dangerous, because she represented something they couldn't control. A king who valued survival over breeding, strength over privilege, humanity over power. That terrified the nobility more than any military threat. King Lucien assembled the royal court the next morning, the throne room filled with every noble family in the capital. Whispers echoed off marble walls as people tried to understand why they'd been summoned with such urgency. Evelyne stood near the throne wearing a simple dress in midnight blue. Her arm was bandaged beneath the sleeve. Her face showed no emotion. She'd learned that trick in the labor camps, how to turn yourself into stone when showing weakness meant death. The king entered wearing full ceremonial armor, black steel edged in gold, the crown of silver thorns, a sword at his hip that had carved through countless enemies. He looked like war personified. The room fell silent. Lucien ascended the throne platform and stood looking down at his assembled court with an expression that promised violence. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the massive chamber. 3 nights ago, assassins attacked Evelyne Rowe inside this palace, inside my home. They were hired by members of this court to murder her because she makes you uncomfortable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The investigation is complete. We have confessions, financial records, testimony from everyone involved. He gestured to the guards. They dragged Lady Callista Morningvale forward first, then her father, High Chancellor, then 3 other nobles who'd contributed to the plot, all of them in chains. Callista's perfect composure had cracked. Her silk dress was wrinkled, her hair disheveled. She looked terrified. Good. King Lucien descended from the throne slowly. You tried to have her killed, he said quietly, stopping in front of Callista. You hired assassins, paid them with family wealth, coordinated the attack with military precision. His golden eyes held hers. Why? Because she's ruining everything. Callista's voice broke. You're destroying yourself for damaged goods, choosing her over the Empire, over your duty, over everything that matters. Lucien smiled. It looked like death. You think she's what's destroying the Empire? He turned to face the assembled nobility. You think caring about someone beneath your station is weakness? He let the question hang. I've conquered territories, crushed rebellions, built this empire into the most powerful force on the continent, and I did it by being exactly what you wanted. Cold, ruthless, treating people like resources to be managed. His voice hardened. That made me strong, effective, and completely hollow. He gestured toward Evelyne. Then I met someone who survived worse than any battlefield I've ever walked, who endured cruelty that would have broken every person in this room, who came out the other side still capable of kindness, still able to care about things that can't offer her anything in return. She doesn't make me weak. She reminds me why empires are worth building, not for power, not for conquest, for the people trying to survive inside them. The throne room was silent. So when you say she's destroying the empire, what you mean is she's destroying your version of it, the one where breeding matters more than character, where accidents of birth determine value, where people who survive suffering are discarded instead of celebrated. He looked at Callista with contempt. Good. That empire deserves to burn. Then he turned to face the guards. Take them to the border territories. Hard labor, no privileges. They can learn what survival actually costs. The nobles screamed protests as guards dragged them away. Their family members tried to intervene. Chaos erupted across the throne room. King Lucien let it happen, let them rage and threaten and promise political consequences. Then he raised one hand. Silence fell immediately. Anyone else want to test me? He looked across the assembled court. Anyone else think protecting her makes me weak? Because I'm happy to demonstrate exactly how wrong you are. Nobody moved. Good. Court dismissed. The nobility fled like mice from a burning building. Within minutes, only Evelyne and the king remained. She stood frozen near the throne, processing what had just happened. He'd just exiled the High Chancellor, one of the most powerful men in the empire, along with his daughter and 3 other noble families. Political suicide. Lucien, she started. Don't, he cut her off. Don't tell me I shouldn't have done it. Don't tell me I'm destroying the empire for you. His expression was fierce. I spent 30 years building power by being something cold and terrible. And it worked. I conquered nations, crushed enemies, made the empire strong. He moved closer. But strength without purpose is just violence. Power without humanity is just cruelty. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Forgot why any of this mattered beyond maintaining control. His hands framed her face gently. You reminded me. Not by being perfect or powerful or noble, just by surviving and still being kind. That's worth more than every political alliance in this empire. Tears burned behind Evelyne's eyes. You're going to lose everything because of me. Then I'll lose everything. His thumb brushed away the tear that escaped. Because a kingdom built on treating people like you as disposable isn't worth keeping. The words broke something inside her that had been holding together through sheer force of will. Because he meant it. Every impossible word. The Iron King was willing to burn his empire to ash rather than let them take her. That kind of devotion was terrifying and beautiful and completely insane. But standing there in an empty throne room with her face cradled in his hands, Evelyne realized something profound. She'd spent her entire life believing she didn't deserve protection, didn't deserve kindness, didn't deserve anything except the suffering the world kept giving her. And here was someone powerful enough to conquer nations choosing her anyway. Not because she was perfect, because she was real. I love you, she whispered. The confession hung between them like something fragile and impossible. King Lucien's expression cracked. Then he kissed her, not gently, not carefully. Like drowning men kiss air. Like something desperate and necessary, and completely beyond control. Evelyne kissed him back with everything she had, all the fear and hope and impossible devotion she'd been carrying. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucien rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said quietly. Enough to destroy everything I've built if it means keeping you safe. And that was the moment Evelyne understood what they'd become. Not king and servant, not savior and saved. 2 damaged souls who'd found each other in the dark and decided that together was better than alone, no matter the cost. But outside the throne room, in corridors and noble estates across the capital, the exiled families were already planning their revenge. Because attacking Evelyne directly had failed, so they'd try something worse. They'd start a war and force the king to choose between the girl he loved and the empire he'd bled to build. The rebellion began exactly 3 weeks after the High Chancellor's exile. Not with armies at the gates, not with dramatic declarations of war. Rebellions never started that way. They began with whispers in dark rooms, with careful manipulation of supply lines, with promises made to men who valued power more than loyalty. The exiled noble families had learned their lesson. Attacking Evelyne directly only made the king more protective, more dangerous, more willing to burn political bridges to keep her safe. So they stopped attacking her and started attacking the empire itself. Understanding this shift requires recognizing something fundamental about power. Direct confrontation with an alpha rarely works because alphas are built for conflict. They thrive in open warfare. What breaks them isn't the enemy they can see and fight. It's the slow erosion of everything they've built. The realization that protecting one thing means losing everything else. That's the real battlefield where kings fall. Not through defeat, but through impossible choices that have no right answer. The first sign came during a routine war council meeting. General Kastov stood at the strategy table looking older than he had a month ago, deep lines carved around his eyes from sleepless nights. "Your Majesty, we have a problem." His voice carried the weight of bad news delivered too many times. 3 border territories have refused the latest tax collection. They claim the crown has become unstable, untrustworthy. King Lucien looked up from the correspondence he'd been reading. His expression showed nothing, but his hands had gone still. "Which territories?" "Nordheim, Ashvale, the Grey March provinces. All territories with strong ties to the exiled families. Not coincidence. Coordination." "What are their specific complaints?" Lucien asked quietly. Kastov hesitated. "They say the crown has abandoned traditional values, that exiling the High Chancellor for protecting imperial interests proves the throne prioritizes personal obsession over the empire's stability." The room fell silent, because everyone knew what personal obsession meant. Evelyne. She sat in her usual chair near the fireplace, trying to make herself invisible, trying not to be the reason the empire was fracturing. But invisibility doesn't work when you're the center of the storm, when your mere existence has become the justification for rebellion. That's the cruelty of being chosen by someone powerful. You become a symbol whether you want to or not, and symbols don't get to control their meaning. Lord Veydrake cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, perhaps if we negotiated a compromise with the exiled families." "No." The word cut like a blade. "They financed an assassination attempt inside the royal palace. There is no compromise for treason. With respect, Your Majesty, if more territories follow Nordheim's example, we could be facing civil war." "Then we fight a civil war." The blunt statement landed like a death sentence. General Kastov stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty, our military is strong, but we can't fight rebellions on 3 fronts simultaneously while maintaining border security against external threats. If this spreads, it won't spread." Lucien's voice stayed level. "We'll make an example of Nordheim, crush the rebellion before it gains momentum, and if that pushes more territories into open revolt, then we crush them too." But underneath the certainty, Evelyne could see the calculation happening behind golden eyes. The king was measuring costs, weighing options, trying to find a way to protect both her and his empire without losing either. The math wasn't working. She knew it. He knew it. Everyone in that room knew it. The rebellion was forcing him toward an impossible choice. And that's what makes this kind of warfare so devastating. It's not about winning battles. It's about creating scenarios where every option leads to loss, where protecting what you love means abandoning what you've built, where duty and devotion pull in opposite directions until something breaks. After the council dispersed, Evelyne found Lucien alone in his study, staring at maps of the empire spread across his desk. Territories marked in different colors: red for loyal, yellow for uncertain, black for open rebellion. Too much black. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept studying the maps like they held answers he couldn't find. "This is because of me," she said quietly. "No, this is because of them." He gestured at the black marks. Nobles who'd rather burn the empire than accept that a king can choose his own path. You exiled the High Chancellor for me, disbanded half your council, turned allies into enemies. The words tasted like ash. They're not wrong, Lucien. You are choosing me over the empire. He looked up finally. Yes, I am. And I'd make the same choice again, even if it costs you everything. Even then. The certainty in his voice should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified her, because she'd spent her entire life being worthless, being disposable, being the thing the world threw away without a second thought. And now the most powerful man alive was willing to watch his empire crumble rather than lose her. That kind of devotion was beautiful and terrible and completely unsustainable. You can't fight the whole empire for me, she whispered. Watch me. But what happens when you win? When you've crushed every rebellion and executed every traitor and finally stand alone on top of the ashes of everything you built? She moved closer. You'll have me, and nothing else. No empire, no legacy, just a broken girl in the ruins of what you destroyed to keep her. Lucien's expression went hard. You think I care about legacy? About what history remembers? I think you're human, and humans need more than one person to build a life around. You need your empire, your purpose, the thing you've spent 30 years creating. I need you. The words hung between them like something precious and fragile. Evelyne looked at the maps covered in markers showing territories falling into rebellion and made a decision that shattered her completely. What if I left? The question landed like a physical blow. King Lucien went perfectly still. What? What if I disappeared? Quietly. Tonight. Just vanished from the palace. The rebellion would lose its purpose. The exiled families would have nothing to rally around. The empire would stabilize. No. You'd still have everything you built. I said no. His voice cracked like a whip. But Evelyne pressed forward because someone had to say the terrible truth out loud. You're going to lose this empire because of me. Not through defeat. Not through weakness. Because you're choosing one person over thousands, and eventually that choice will break everything you've built. She forced herself to hold his gaze. Let me go, before it costs you more than you can afford to lose. The silence that followed felt like falling. This is where the philosophy of survival gets complicated, because survival isn't always about staying alive. Sometimes it's about knowing when to walk away, when to sacrifice yourself so someone else can keep going. Evelyne had learned that lesson in the labor camps, that the strong protect the weak by taking the punishment meant for them. That love sometimes looks like letting go. She was trying to give Lucien the gift of not having to choose, trying to save him from his own devotion. King Lucien moved around the desk slowly, predator careful. He stopped inches away, close enough that she could feel heat radiating off him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and absolutely lethal. You think I'd let you sacrifice yourself to save my empire? You think I'd watch you walk away into the dark and just let it happen? I think I'm not worth what you're paying. That's not your decision to make. Yes, it is. She felt tears burning but refused to let them fall. You can survive losing me. You can rebuild alliances, bring back the exiled families, stabilize the empire, go back to being the Iron King everyone feared. But if you keep choosing me, you'll destroy everything, and eventually you'll hate me for it. Lucien's hand caught her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me very carefully. I don't care about the empire more than I care about you. I don't care about legacy or history or what people remember after I'm dead. I care about you, only you. And if keeping you means burning everything else to ash, then pass me the torch. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. The conviction in his voice made her chest ache, because he did mean it. Every impossible word. The king who'd conquered nations was willing to watch his empire collapse rather than lose the broken girl who'd reminded him what it felt like to be human. That knowledge was beautiful and terrible and completely unfair. Before she could respond, the study door crashed open. General Kastoff stood in the doorway, covered in blood and soot, breathing hard. Behind him, the palace hallway glowed orange with firelight. Your Majesty. The words came out ragged. The southern barracks are burning. Coordinated attack. Multiple explosions. They hit the armory, the medical wing, guard stations across the lower city. King Lucien's entire demeanor changed instantly, from lover to warrior in a heartbeat. Casualties? At least 40 dead. More wounded. Still counting. The general's face was grim. Your Majesty, this wasn't opportunistic rebellion. This was military precision. Someone fed them our guard rotations, our armory locations, internal security details, which meant a traitor inside the palace. Lucien was already moving, grabbing his sword belt from where it hung near the desk. He buckled it on with practiced efficiency while issuing orders. Full lockdown. Seal the palace. Nobody enters or leaves without my direct authorization. Deploy the royal guard to protect the medical wings and food stores. Get me a casualty list within the hour. He looked at Evelyne. You stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. Then he was gone. General Kastov following close behind, their boots echoing down the corridor toward chaos and fire and death. Evelyne stood alone in the study, listening to screams rising from the lower city. The rebellion had moved inside the walls, and somewhere in the burning palace, people who'd pledged loyalty to the crown were coordinating its destruction from within. This is the moment where loyalty becomes currency, where trust transforms into a weapon that can be wielded against you. An Alpha King's greatest strength is inspiring devotion, but devotion can be bought, redirected, turned against the very thing it was supposed to protect. The exiled families understood this. They weren't trying to defeat Lucien militarily. They were proving that his choice to protect Evelyne had fractured the bonds holding his empire together. That loyalty built on fear crumbles the moment something more important appears. The fires burned for 3 hours before the royal guard contained them. 43 soldiers dead, another 60 wounded, the southern armory destroyed, 2 medical wings collapsed, grain stores contaminated, surgical devastation designed to cripple infrastructure without directly attacking the throne. Brilliant and terrifying. By dawn, King Lucien had assembled the remaining council in the war room. His armor was scorched black. Blood stained his hands. Ash smudged his face. His expression promised violence that would make previous punishments look merciful. We have a traitor inside the palace. His voice cut through the exhausted silence. Someone with access to guard rotations, armory locations, and security protocols. Someone who coordinated a military strike from inside our walls while we were distracted with external rebellion. The council members looked at each other with expressions ranging from shock to poorly concealed fear. Because everyone in that room had access to sensitive information, anyone could be the traitor. General Kastov stepped forward with a sealed letter. Your Majesty, we found this in the burned barracks. It's addressed to you. Lucien broke the seal and read in silence. His expression went perfectly blank, which was worse than rage. When he looked up, his golden eyes held something that made even his most loyal generals step back. They're offering terms, he said quietly. The rebel territories will stand down. The attacks will stop. The empire will stabilize. He paused. If I execute Evelyne Rowe as a traitor and restore the exiled families to their positions. The war room erupted. Voices overlapped in chaos, some demanding he reject the terms immediately, others pointing out that one life wasn't worth civil war. A few brave enough to suggest that perhaps the empire's stability did matter more than personal attachment. Lucien let them argue, let them reveal exactly where their loyalties fell. Then he raised one hand and silence crashed down like a blade. Anyone who thinks I'm considering these terms can leave now. Walk out that door. I'll consider it your resignation from service rather than treason. Nobody moved. Good. Because I need you to understand something. He looked at each council member in turn. The rebellion wants me to choose between Evelyne and the Empire. They think forcing that choice will break me, make me vulnerable. His smile looked like death. They're right that it's a choice. They're wrong about which option I'll pick. Lord Varen spoke carefully. Your Majesty, if we reject their terms, the rebellion will spread. More territories will fall. We could lose half the Empire. Then we lose half the Empire. Lucien's voice stayed flat. I've conquered territories before. I can do it again. What I won't do is execute an innocent woman to appease traitors. With respect, Your Majesty, she's not innocent. Lady Thorne's voice dripped venom. She's the catalyst for this entire disaster. Her presence has destabilized the throne, fractured the council, and given the rebellion exactly what they needed to justify revolt. So this is her fault? The king's voice dropped to something dangerous. Not the nobles who financed assassination attempts? Not the territories that chose rebellion over loyalty? Not the traitor currently walking these halls feeding information to our enemies? He moved toward Lady Thorne with predator grace. She's guilty of surviving, of being chosen by someone they thought belonged to them, of reminding everyone in this palace that value doesn't require noble blood. His hand slammed down on the war table hard enough to make everyone flinch. If that's a crime worth execution, then you're all guilty too, because every person in this room has been protected by privilege they didn't earn. The only difference is she's honest about surviving things you've never had to face. The truth landed like hammer blows. But underneath the righteous anger, Evelyne could hear something else. Desperation. Because Lucien was defending her with everything he had while his empire burned around them, and the math still wasn't working. Choose the girl. Lose the empire. Choose the empire. Lose the girl. No third option, no compromise, just two impossible outcomes. That was when the second letter arrived. A palace runner burst into the war room covered in ash, breathing hard. He carried another sealed message. From the Northern Territories, the runner gasped. They're joining the rebellion unless demands are met within 3 days. Lucien took the letter. Read it. His expression went dead. The Northern Territories were the Empire's industrial backbone. Losing them meant losing weapons production, steel, resources. Everything needed to fight a prolonged civil war. The rebellion was tightening the noose. King Lucien looked at the maps showing his empire fragmenting piece by piece, at the council members waiting for him to make a decision that wouldn't destroy everything, at Evelyne standing near the door trying to be invisible while the empire collapsed around her existence. And she saw the moment he started calculating whether he could win this war, whether love was worth the cost. 3 days, he said quietly. We have 3 days to find the traitor and crush the rebellion before it spreads beyond containment. He looked at General Kastoff. Double the guard rotations. Interrogate anyone with access to the information that was leaked. I want the traitor identified before the deadline. The general nodded and left immediately, taking half the council with him. Only Lord Veydrake remained behind, looking older than his years. Your Majesty, he said carefully, if we can't find the traitor in time, we will. But if we can't, you'll need to consider... I've considered everything. Lucien's voice carried finality. Find me the traitor. That's an order. Lord Veydrake bowed and left, leaving the king alone with Evelyne in a war room covered in maps of a dying empire. The silence stretched between them like an open wound. You're running out of time, Evelyne said quietly. I know. 3 days to find a traitor who's probably too well hidden to expose, who might be someone you trust completely. She moved closer. And if you can't find them, you'll have to choose. I already made my choice. But his voice cracked slightly on the words, because even the Iron King couldn't defy reality forever, couldn't protect one person while an empire burned, couldn't choose love over responsibility without consequences that would haunt him the rest of his life. Here's what they don't tell you about being an alpha. The myth says alphas are strongest when they're alone, unattached, free to make ruthless decisions without emotional complications. But that's a lie designed to keep them isolated. The truth is more complicated. Alphas are strongest when they have something worth protecting, something that reminds them why power matters. But that strength comes with a price, because the moment you love something, you give your enemies a target, a lever they can use to move you. The rebellion understood this perfectly. They'd found Lucien's weakness and were exploiting it with surgical precision. Evelyne looked at this man who'd promised to destroy everything for her and made a decision. She'd save him from himself, even if it meant breaking both their hearts. The next 2 days passed in mounting tension. Interrogations yielded nothing. The traitor was either too skilled or too well protected to expose through conventional methods. Guard rotations were tripled, security protocols rewritten. But paranoia infected the palace like disease. Nobody trusted anyone. Servants eyed each other with suspicion. Guards questioned their own comrades. Council members stopped sharing information, afraid it would be used against them. The rebellion had already won in the ways that mattered most. They'd turned the palace against itself, created an environment where loyalty was performance and trust was suicide. Evelyne watched it unfold from her quarters in the eastern wing, watched Lucien grow harder, more isolated, more willing to see enemies everywhere because enemies were everywhere. He came to her room on the second night looking like death. Armor still on, sword still belted. He hadn't slept in 48 hours, and it showed in the hollows under his eyes. "We can't find them," he said without preamble. "Whoever the traitor is, they're invisible, protected. Probably someone I've trusted for years." He sat heavily in the chair by her fireplace. "Tomorrow is the deadline. Tomorrow I have to decide whether to let the Empire burn or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Evelyne knelt in front of him, taking his blood-stained hands in hers. "You know what you have to do." "No." "Lucien, look at me." She waited until his golden eyes met hers. "You built this empire from nothing, conquered territories, brought stability to a continent that was tearing itself apart. That matters. Those thousands of lives you protect matter. You matter more. I'm one person." She squeezed his hands. "One broken person who got lucky enough to be noticed by someone powerful. But I'm not worth losing everything you've built." "Yes, you are." The words came out fierce and broken. "She loves you too much to let you destroy yourself for her. That's what survival teaches you, that sometimes loving someone means walking away, means making the hard choice they can't make themselves, means being strong enough to let go." Evelyne stood and moved to her desk, pulled out the 3 letters she'd written, the one she'd been carrying for 2 days, waiting for the right moment. She handed him one. "What's this?" His voice was flat with exhaustion. "My confession, that I've been the traitor all along, that I fed information to the rebellion to destabilize your rule, that everything you suspected about me was true." Lucien looked at the letter like it was a live weapon. "This is a lie. It's a solution." She kept her voice steady. "You give them what they want. Execute the traitor. The rebellion stands down. The empire stabilizes. You keep everything you built. Evelyne, I'm signing it, confessing to treason, giving you permission to do what needs to be done. I won't kill you. You won't have to." She'd thought this through, worked out every detail. Public execution. "But you switch me out beforehand. Execute someone else. A criminal already sentenced to death. I disappear into the crowd. Leave the capital. Vanish." His expression was cracking, breaking. "You get to keep your empire and your honor. The rebellion loses its leverage. And I get to survive by being invisible again. Everyone wins, except us." The words hung in the air like something dying. Evelyne felt tears burning, but refused to let them fall. "We were never going to survive this, Lucien. Not really. You're a king. I'm a ghost. Those things don't build futures together. You made me human again, and you made me matter. For the first time in my life, someone saw me as worth protecting." She smiled through the pain. "That's enough. That's more than I ever thought I'd have. It's not enough for me. Then you're going to have to learn to live with not enough. Because tomorrow that deadline hits and you'll be forced to choose. I'm giving you a way out. A way to keep everything without losing everything." She pushed the confession letter toward him. "Take it. Use it. Save your empire." King Lucien looked at the letter. At her. At the impossible choice laid out in ink and desperation. And Evelyne saw the moment something inside him shattered completely. Because she was right. The deadline was coming. The choice was unavoidable. And loving her meant accepting the solution she was offering, even if it destroyed them both. He took the letter with shaking hands. "I'll never forgive you for this," he whispered. "I know." She touched his face gently. "But you'll survive it, and survival is all that matters." The words tasted like ash, because she was giving him the same lesson the world had taught her years ago, that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you hate, that love sometimes looks like letting go, that broken things don't get happy endings, they just get different versions of surviving. The night before the deadline, Evelyne prepared to disappear. She'd done this before. Knew how to become invisible, how to fade into crowds and slip through cracks in the city's defenses, how to survive with nothing. She'd written final letters, made her peace, said goodbye to the greenhouse and the Eastern Wing quarters, and everything that had made her believe she could be someone worth keeping. Midnight came. She changed into simple servant clothes, took nothing, left behind every gift Lucien had given her because taking them felt like theft. The palace was quiet. Guards rotated. She knew the patterns, knew exactly when to move. She slipped into the corridor and started walking toward the servants' exit. That's when she heard voices, low, urgent, coming from one of the side chambers. She should have kept walking, should have ignored it, but something in the tone made her stop, made her press against the wall and listen. "Tomorrow we move." The voice was familiar, male, someone from the council. "Once the king executes the girl, the rebellion will stand down. The exiled families will return, and we'll have control again." Another voice, younger. "You're certain he'll go through with it?" "He has no choice. We've forced his hand perfectly. Either he executes her and keeps the empire, or refuses and watches everything burn. He'll choose the empire. He's too pragmatic to do otherwise. And if he doesn't? Then the northern territories invade, and we finish this with military force. Either way, the Iron King learns that choosing some nobody over the nobility was his biggest mistake. Laughter, cold and satisfied. Evelyne's blood turned to ice, because she recognized that first voice now. Lord Veydrake, the king's most trusted advisor, the man who'd served beside Lucien for 15 years, who'd fought in campaigns and sat in councils and sworn loyalty to the crown. The traitor. He wasn't feeding information to the rebellion. He was the rebellion, working from inside the palace to orchestrate everything. The attacks, the deadline, the impossible choice, all of it designed to break the king by forcing him to choose between love and duty. Evelyne stood frozen outside that door, processing the implications. If she told Lucien, he could arrest Veydrake, expose the conspiracy, prove the rebellion was manufactured. But it wouldn't change the fundamental problem. The northern territories had still joined the revolt. The empire was still fracturing. The deadline was still coming. Exposing Veydrake might buy time, but it wouldn't solve anything. Unless an idea formed in her mind, terrible and desperate and completely insane. What if she became what they expected? What if she stopped trying to save Lucien from the choice and instead gave him a different option? Not execution, not disappearance. War. Because the one thing the rebellion wasn't prepared for was Evelyne fighting back. They'd spent weeks positioning her as the victim, the catalyst, the problem that needed eliminating. What if she became the solution instead? She moved away from the door silently, started walking, not toward the servants' exit, toward the king's study, toward the choice that would transform her from ghost into something dangerous. She found Lucien alone, staring at her confession letter like it was a death sentence. He looked up when she entered. His expression was devastated. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "I can't execute you, even for the empire, even to save everything. I can't. I know." She closed the door behind her. "That's why I'm not asking you to anymore." "What?" "I found the traitor. Lord Veydrake. He's been orchestrating everything from inside the palace, working with the exiled families to manufacture this entire crisis." Lucien stood so fast his chair crashed backward. "Veydrake?" I heard him. "Tonight. Planning what happens after you execute me tomorrow." She moved closer. "He thinks he's won, that he's forced you into an impossible position." His expression went deadly. "Where is he?" "Still in the south corridor planning his victory." "But Lucien, arresting him doesn't solve the real problem. The rebellion is still real. The territories still demand your choice. Then what do you suggest? Give them a different choice." She met his eyes. "Don't execute me. Don't let me disappear. Make me your weapon instead." "What are you talking about?" "You said I remind you what it means to be human. What if I reminded the empire instead?" She could see the plan forming, crystallizing. What if instead of being the thing you sacrifice, I become the thing you fight for, publicly, completely, with no apologies? "The northern territories think you're weak for choosing me. Prove them wrong. Show them that an alpha protecting what he loves is more dangerous than one protecting what he's supposed to." "That's insane." "Maybe, but it's better than the alternative." She moved closer. "You've spent 3 weeks defending me apologetically, like I'm a weakness you're trying to justify. Stop defending. Start declaring. Make them understand that I'm not your weakness. I'm your line in the sand. And if that pushes more territories into rebellion, then we crush them, together." The words hung between them like a declaration of war, because that's what it was. Not surrender, not compromise. A decision to fight for what mattered instead of sacrificing it to maintain peace. King Lucien looked at her like he was seeing someone completely new. "You're not trying to save me anymore." "No, She smiled. I'm trying to save us both by refusing to be saved. That's the most terrifying thing you've ever said. Good. She took his hand. Because the Empire needs to be terrified of what we'll do if they try to take this away. His fingers tightened around hers. And just like that, the impossible choice transformed into something else entirely. Not which to sacrifice, but what to fight for, even if it meant watching the Empire burn. The arrest happened at dawn. King Lucien didn't waste time with formal accusations or lengthy interrogations. He walked into Lord Varen's quarters flanked by the royal guard, while the traitor was still sleeping, dragged him from his bed, and had him chained before the man could finish stammering denials. The entire palace woke to the sound of steel on stone and a voice that could shatter mountains. Lord Varen stands accused of treason. The king's words echoed through marble corridors as guards marched the bound advisor toward the throne room. Of orchestrating rebellion from within these walls, of conspiring with exiled families to destabilize the crown, of manufacturing the crisis that has cost 43 soldiers their lives. Nobles emerged from their quarters in nightclothes, eyes wide with shock. Servants pressed against walls as the procession passed. Everyone who'd trusted Varen, everyone who'd believed his loyalty was unshakable, all of them watching their certainty collapse. By the time they reached the throne room, half the court had assembled in various states of dress and disbelief. The massive chamber filled with whispers that died the moment King Lucien ascended the platform. He didn't sit, just stood there in full armor with Varen kneeling in chains at the base of the steps. Evelyne entered from the side corridor wearing a dress the color of blood and midnight, not servant clothes, not the simple modest garment she'd hidden in for years. This was silk and structure, expensive and deliberate, a statement that she was done apologizing for existing. She took her position beside the throne, not behind it, not hidden, beside it. Every eye in the room tracked her movement with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. The king looked at his assembled court with cold assessment. Some of you are wondering if the accusations against Lord Varen are true. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through flesh. Others are calculating how this changes the political landscape. A few are already planning how to exploit the chaos. He let that sink in. All of you are missing the point. Lucien gestured to the guards. They dragged forward 3 more nobles in chains, lesser lords who'd been caught in Varen's conspiracy, men who'd taken money from exiled families to spread poison through the court. The point is that this empire has rotted from the inside, not because of external threats, not because of military weakness, because we've built a system where breeding matters more than character, where survival is punished and privilege is worshipped, where people who endure suffering are discarded while those who inflict it are celebrated. His golden eyes swept across the horrified nobility. That ends today. Understanding what comes next requires grasping something fundamental about power and transformation. When an alpha decides to stop playing by rules designed to constrain them, they become exponentially more dangerous. Not because they're stronger or smarter, because they've stopped caring about the consequences. They've identified what matters most and subordinated everything else to protecting it. That's what the court was witnessing, not a king defending a controversial choice. A king who'd decided that burning the empire was acceptable collateral damage if it meant keeping what he loved. Lord Varen finally found his voice. Your Majesty, I can explain... Explain what? That you've been feeding military intelligence to rebel territories? That you orchestrated the attack on the southern barracks? That you manufactured this entire deadline to force me into executing an innocent woman? The accusations landed like hammer blows. Varen's face cycled through emotions. Denial, anger, then calculation. The look of someone realizing their careful plans had collapsed, but searching for any remaining leverage. You don't understand what you're doing, he said quietly. The northern territories won't accept this. The rebellion isn't just about her anymore. It's about the empire's direction. About whether we maintain the traditions that made us strong or abandon them for sentiment. Sentiment. Lucien repeated the word like it tasted poisonous. You mean caring about people beyond their utility, valuing survival over breeding, treating humans as more than resources to exploit. He descended the steps slowly. Yes, I'm guilty of sentiment, of looking at someone the world discarded and recognizing value everyone else missed, of choosing humanity over tradition. He stopped in front of Veyron. And I'd do it again, every single time. The throne room held its breath. You're destroying the empire for her, Veyron hissed. Can't you see that? The territories are rebelling because they've lost faith in your judgment, because you've proven you'll sacrifice stability for one damaged girl who means nothing. Lucien hit him, not a slap. A closed fist that snapped Veyron's head sideways hard enough that blood sprayed across marble. The crack echoed through the chamber like breaking bone. The court gasped collectively. The king stood over his former advisor with an expression that promised worse violence. She means everything. His voice stayed quiet, controlled, which made it more terrifying. And the territories rebelling because they can't accept that are revealing themselves as enemies that were always going to challenge the throne eventually. You just gave them convenient excuse. He gestured to the guards. Take him to the interrogation chambers. I want every name, every family, every noble who financed this conspiracy. We're cutting out the rot completely. As Veyron was dragged away still bleeding, King Lucien turned to face his assembled court. The deadline is in 6 hours. The Northern Territories demand I execute Evelyne Rowe to prove the crown values stability over personal attachment. He moved back to the throne platform, stopped beside Evelyne, took her hand in his. Here's my answer. The gesture was deliberate, public, unmistakable. I will not execute her. I will not hide her. I will not apologize for choosing someone who survived hell and came out the other side still capable of kindness. She is not my weakness. She is proof that this empire can value something besides power and conquest. His grip tightened on her hand. Any territory that rebels over this decision was already an enemy waiting to reveal themselves. So let them come. Let them challenge the crown. Let them learn what happens when they mistake humanity for weakness. The throne room erupted in chaos. Nobles shouting, council members protesting, guards shifting nervously. The whole carefully constructed hierarchy of the empire fracturing in real time. Evelyne stood beside the king, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. This was it. The point of no return. They'd just declared war on everyone who thought she didn't belong. Lucien raised one hand and silence crashed down. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you how things are. He looked at each council member in turn. Anyone who can't accept this can leave. Resign your position. Depart the capital. I'll consider it a peaceful separation rather than treason. He paused. But if you stay, you fight. For this empire. For what it could become instead of what it's been. For the idea that value comes from character, not circumstance. No one moved toward the door. Good. Because we have 6 hours to prepare for war. The War Council assembled with brutal efficiency. Maps spread across tables showing territory positions, troop deployments, supply lines. General Kastov laid out the tactical situation with the grim precision of someone who'd fought too many battles. The Northern Territories will mobilize within hours of the deadline passing. He pointed to marked positions. They have approximately 15,000 troops, well-trained, well-supplied, led by General Thrace, who's never lost a campaign. How many can we field? Lucien asked. 8,000 immediately, another 3,000 within a week if we pull from border garrisons. But that leaves us vulnerable to external threats. Then we fight with 8,000. Your Majesty, we're outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. I can count, Kastov. Lucien's voice stayed level. What I need is strategy to compensate for numbers. The general hesitated, then looked at Evelyne standing near the fireplace. With respect, Your Majesty, this would be significantly easier if we remove the rebellion's primary justification. The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Because Kastov was right. Tactically, strategically, from every military perspective, executing Evelyne or forcing her into exile would solve the immediate problem. Would give them time to regroup. Would prevent a war they might lose. Evelyne met the general's gaze steadily. You're right, this would be easier without me. Kastov looked surprised that she'd agreed, but easy isn't always right. She moved closer to the war table. The rebellion isn't actually about me. It's about whether the Empire continues valuing privilege over character, whether survival of cruelty makes someone disposable or proves their strength. She looked at the maps showing enemy positions. If the king executes me or lets me disappear, he's admitting they're correct, that I'm worthless, that protecting me was a mistake. She met Lucien's eyes, and that lie would poison everything he's trying to build. The silence that followed carried weight. This is where philosophy meets reality, where abstract principles about human value clash against concrete consequences measured in lives lost and territories fallen. It's easy to talk about standing for something when the cost is theoretical. The test comes when choosing principles means accepting devastation, when refusing to compromise means watching people die for your convictions. That's the burden true leaders carry, not the weight of power, but the weight of consequences that flow from wielding it according to conscience instead of convenience. General Kastov looked between them, then nodded slowly. If we're committing to this path, we need to compensate for numerical disadvantage with tactical superiority. He started marking positions on the map. The northern forces will expect traditional engagement, infantry lines, cavalry flanks, standard imperial doctrine. So we give them something else, Lucien said. Kastov's expression turned calculating. The old mountain passes through gray march, narrow corridors where numbers don't matter as much. If we force engagement there instead of open field, we negate their advantage. The king studied the terrain. How long to position our forces? 36 hours if we move immediately. Then we move. Lucien looked at his remaining council. Empty the treasury if needed. Pay double wages to soldiers who march tonight. Strip the palace guard to minimum coverage and send everyone else north. Your Majesty, leaving the palace undermanned is necessary. He cut off the objection. The war isn't here. It's in those mountain passes. Either we win there or the capital falls anyway. The council scrambled to execute orders. Within minutes, the war room emptied except for Lucien and Evelyne. She looked at the maps showing impossible odds and felt guilt crushing her chest. All of this because I exist. No. He pulled her close. All of this because an empire built on cruelty finally got challenged. You're not the cause. You're the catalyst that forced everyone to choose what they actually value. His hand cupped her face. And I choose you. Every time. In every version of this scenario. I choose you. Even if it means losing? Especially then. Because losing while fighting for something real is better than winning by sacrificing it. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a death sentence, because the math hadn't changed. 8,000 against 15,000. Mountain passes or not. Tactical advantage or not. They were probably going to lose. And when they did, the rebellion would execute her anyway, after watching Lucien die trying to protect her. That was the real nightmare, not her own death. Watching him fall because he'd valued her more than survival. I'm scared, she whispered. Good. Fear means you're human. He kissed her forehead. We're both scared, but we're scared together. That has to count for something. The army mobilized at sunset. 8,000 soldiers marched north through the capital, while citizens watched from windows and doorways. The Royal Guard in black armor. Infantry units carrying pikes and shields. Cavalry on war horses bred for mountain terrain. Supply wagons loaded with everything needed to sustain a campaign. King Lucien rode at the front wearing full ceremonial armor that caught the dying light. The crown of silver thorns, his sword belted at his hip, every inch the Iron King leading his forces to war. Evelyne rode beside him. That shocked the assembled crowd more than anything else. The girl who'd been a ghost for years. The servant everyone had ignored. Now mounted on a white horse wearing armor commissioned specifically for her. Not decorative plate meant for show, real protection. Steel and leather designed to keep her alive. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't staying safe in the palace while men fought her battles. She was fighting beside them. They rode through streets lined with people who didn't know whether to cheer or mourn. This wasn't a victory procession. It was an army marching toward probable death because their king had chosen humanity over politics. Some understood what that meant. Others just saw madness. Both were partially correct. The journey north took 30 hours of hard riding. They stopped only when horses needed rest or soldiers required food. Lucien drove them relentlessly because every hour mattered. Every delay gave the northern forces time to position better. Evelyne rode through exhaustion that made her bones ache. Her thighs screamed from hours in the saddle. Blisters formed under her armor. But she didn't complain, didn't ask for special treatment. Because 8,000 soldiers were marching to possible death partly because of her. The least she could do was suffer alongside them. They reached the Grey March passes as dawn broke on the second day. The mountains rose like stone teeth against the sky. Narrow corridors carved through rock by ancient glaciers. Cliffs on both sides that turned the passages into natural killboxes. Exactly the terrain General Kastov had described. Terrain where numbers mattered less than positioning. The army spread through the passes in defensive formations, archers on the heights, infantry blocking the corridors, cavalry held in reserve for counterattacks. Every soldier positioned to maximize the advantage of fighting in confined spaces. Then they waited. Waiting before battle is its own form of torture. Minutes stretch into hours. Fear compounds. Imagination runs wild with every terrible outcome. Soldiers check weapons repeatedly, adjust armor that doesn't need adjusting, tell jokes that aren't funny. Anything to distract from the knowledge that soon they'll be killing or dying or both. That's when you discover who you really are. Not in the heat of combat, but in the cold certainty beforehand. When there's still time to run, but you choose to stay anyway. Evelyne stood on a cliff overlooking the main pass, watching the horizon for signs of the Northern Army. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd never been in a real battle, never faced violence on this scale. Everything that had happened to her before had been personal, individual cruelty, targeted abuse. She'd survived by being invisible. This was different. Armies clashing, thousands dying, and she couldn't be invisible anymore. Lucien found her there as the sun climbed higher. You should be further back, behind the lines where it's safer. I should be a lot of things. She didn't look at him. Invisible, insignificant, dead in a labor camp somewhere. But I'm here instead, right beside you, where I choose to be. Evelyne, no. She turned to face him. You've spent weeks protecting me, defending me, fighting for me. Let me fight beside you for once. Let me be strong enough to stand in the fire instead of hiding behind you. You don't have to prove anything. Yes, I do. To myself. I need to know I can be more than what the world tried to make me. More than a victim. More than someone who survives by disappearing. Her voice cracked but held. I need to know I can matter by choice. Not just because you chose me. Understanding dawned in his golden eyes, because that was the real transformation happening. Not just Lucien learning to value someone the Empire called worthless, but Evelyne learning to value herself. Learning that worth came from internal conviction, not external validation. That mattering meant standing for something even when standing was terrifying. All right. He handed her a sword. It's lighter than standard issue, balanced for your build. General Kastov supervised the forging personally. She took the weapon, felt its weight. The leather grip worn smooth, the blade sharp enough to split hair. A real weapon. Not decorative, not symbolic. An acknowledgement that she was choosing to fight. Stay close to me during the engagement, Lucien said. If things go wrong, the Royal Guard will extract us both. Don't argue. Don't try to be heroic, just survive. Same goes for you. He smiled. Deal. They stood together on that cliff watching the horizon while an army prepared for war behind them. And Evelyne felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear disappearing. Fear was still there, still clawing at her throat. But underneath it, something harder. Determination. She'd spent her entire life being someone things happened to. Someone the world acted upon, shaped, damaged, discarded. Not anymore. Today she was choosing what happened next, even if it killed her. Tick. The Northern Army appeared at noon. 15,000 soldiers in disciplined formations marching through the valley toward the mountain passes. Their armor caught sunlight, banners snapped in the wind. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed off stone like distant thunder. General Thrace led from the front on a black destrier. A man who'd never lost a campaign. Who understood tactics and terrain and how to leverage superior numbers into inevitable victory. He saw the narrow passes, saw the defensive positions, saw exactly what King Lucien was attempting, and smiled. Because mountain passes worked both ways. They restricted movement, made retreat nearly impossible, which meant if Thrace could force engagement and overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers, the Royal Army would be trapped, slaughtered. The northern forces split into 3 columns, each targeting a different pass. Coordinated assault designed to stretch the defenders thin, force them to choose which corridor to prioritize while the others got overrun. Standard doctrine for attacking entrenched positions. King Lucien watched the deployment from his command position. They're splitting their forces. General Kastov's voice carried tension, testing all 3 passes simultaneously. Let them. Lucien's expression stayed calm. We hold the central pass with everything we have. The side corridors are mined with explosives. Once their columns commit, we collapse the passages and trap them. Kastov's eyes widened. That will kill thousands. Yes. The king's voice went cold. It will also save my soldiers from fighting a war they can't win conventionally. Your Majesty, using explosives on that scale, is necessary. Lucien looked at his general. I'm not interested in fighting honorably. I'm interested in winning. They brought 15,000 soldiers to crush 8,000. I brought willingness to do whatever it takes. This is the moment where principles meet brutality, where the Alpha who claimed to value humanity revealed he was willing to employ massive violence to protect it. The paradox at the heart of power. Caring deeply about individual human worth while being capable of industrial-scale killing to defend it. That's what makes true leaders terrifying, not their cruelty, their capacity to subordinate their own moral discomfort to necessary action, to carry the weight of decisions that haunt them forever, because not making those decisions would cost even more. The Northern Army advanced into the passes, thousands of soldiers funneling into narrow corridors, shields raised, weapons ready, moving with the confidence of superior numbers. They made it 50 yards before the first explosions detonated. The side passages collapsed in thunder and fire. Rock fell in avalanches that buried entire columns instantly. Screams cut off as tons of stone crushed men and horses alike. Dust clouds rose like funeral shrouds. When the noise faded, 2 of the 3 northern columns had been eliminated completely. 5,000 soldiers dead in seconds. General Thrace stared at the collapsed passages with an expression of absolute horror, then rage, pure incandescent fury at being outmaneuvered through tactics he considered beneath honorable warfare. He turned his remaining 10,000 toward the central pass, where King Lucien waited with 8,000 soldiers and the grim acceptance of someone who'd just crossed a moral line he could never uncross. The Northern Army charged, and the real battle began. Combat is chaos given form. All the training and tactics and careful positioning dissolve the moment steel meets flesh and people start dying. Soldiers scream, horses scream. The wounded beg for help that isn't coming. Blood turns stone slippery. Bodies pile up, creating obstacles that weren't in any battle plan. Evelyne found herself in the center of it within minutes. The northern forces hit the defensive line like a hammer against an anvil, impact that shook the ground. The sound of thousands of men killing each other filled the mountain pass with noise that made thinking impossible. She fought beside Lucien and the royal guard. Her sword was lighter than she expected, sharper. She blocked a strike from a northern soldier, countered, felt resistance as her blade found flesh. The man fell. She'd killed someone. No time to process. Another attacker. Block, strike, keep moving or die. This was nothing like the individual violence she'd survived before. This was mechanical, industrial, human beings as components in a meat grinder measuring territory in corpses. King Lucien fought like something inhuman. His sword moved too fast to follow. Every strike killed, every movement positioned him between Evelyne and threats. He was protecting her even while fighting for his life. The battle compressed into moments disconnected from time. A northern soldier grabbing her arm, her knife finding his throat. General Kastov screaming orders that got lost in the noise. A horse falling, crushing its rider. Blood soaking into her armor. Hers or someone else's. Impossible to tell. Lucien's voice cutting through chaos. Stay close. Don't stop moving. Her muscles burning. Lungs screaming for air. Keep fighting, because stopping means dying. Then the northern line broke. Not completely. Not routed. But cracked enough that the royal forces could push forward. Could turn defense into counterattack. General Thrace saw it happening. saw his numerical advantage being negated by terrain and desperation and soldiers willing to die rather than surrender. He made the tactical decision: retreat, regroup, try again with different approach. The Northern Army pulled back, leaving hundreds of dead littering the pass. The royal forces didn't pursue, just held position while medics moved among the wounded and soldiers caught their breath. The first engagement was over. Both sides had bled. Both had learned what the other was capable of, and both knew the war had just begun. Evelyne stood among bodies wearing armor painted red with blood that wasn't hers. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her sword. Her legs felt like they might give out. She'd survived, somehow. Lucien appeared beside her, pulling her close despite the blood and filth covering them both. "You all right?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to be strong, wanted to prove she could handle this. Instead, she bent over and vomited. He held her hair back and didn't say anything until she finished, then handed her water. "First battle is always the worst," he said quietly. "The reality of it. The noise and blood and knowing you killed someone who was just following orders. I thought I was stronger than this. You are strong. You're just also human. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." She rinsed her mouth, looked at the carnage filling the pass. "How many? Ours? About 400 dead, another 600 wounded." He glanced at the northern casualties. "Theirs? At least 1,000 between the explosives and the engagement." His voice carried no satisfaction. "Just grim accounting. They'll attack again before nightfall. Try to overwhelm us through attrition. Keep hitting until we break. Can we hold? For a while. But Kastov estimates we have maybe 2 more engagements before our numbers get too depleted to maintain defensive positions. Which means we need to end this faster." He looked toward where the Northern Army was regrouping in the valley. "I'm going to offer Thrace single combat. Leader against leader. Winner takes the field." Evelyne's blood went cold. "That's suicide. He's never lost a fight. Neither have I." "Lucien, it's the only way to avoid watching both armies bleed to death over the next 3 days." His expression was set. "And if I lose, you run. The Royal Guard will get you out. You disappear, live quietly somewhere, the rebellion will never find you." "No, not negotiable." He gripped her shoulders. "If I fall, you survive. That's an order." "You don't get to order me anymore." Her voice broke. "You made me your equal, stood me beside the throne. You don't get to go back to treating me like someone who needs protecting now that it's convenient. I'm not trying to protect you from inconvenience. I'm trying to keep you alive. Then stay alive yourself." She met his eyes. "Win. Don't sacrifice yourself in single combat and call it strategy. Win and come back to me." The words hung between them like a vow. Lucien pulled her close, kissed her hard enough to bruise. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you," he said. "Then prove it by surviving." He smiled despite everything. "Deal." Then he was walking toward the center of the pass, toward where General Thrace stood among his regrouping forces, toward the challenge that would decide everything. Evelyne watched him go and felt her heart trying to tear itself apart. Because she'd just sent the man she loved into a fight he might not win. All because she'd refused to disappear when disappearing would have prevented this entire war. That knowledge was going to haunt her the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. Chas, King Lucien Veydrake stood in the center of the mountain pass and raised his voice to carry across the battlefield. "General Thrace, I'm offering single combat, you and me. Winner claims the field. Loser's army retreats. Spare both sides from fighting a war of attrition that benefits neither of us." The challenge echoed off stone. The Northern Army went quiet. Thousands of soldiers watching to see how their commander would respond. General Thrace stepped forward, a man in his 50s with gray hair and scars that told stories of decades fighting. He looked at Lucien with the assessment of someone measuring an opponent. "Why would I agree to that?" His voice carried the rough confidence of someone who'd never needed to doubt himself. "I have superior numbers. I can afford to bleed you dry over days. Eventually your line breaks and I win anyway." "Eventually." Lucien's voice stayed level. "But how many of your soldiers die first? How many mothers lose sons? How many wives lose husbands? All because nobles in the capital couldn't accept that their king chose humanity over hierarchy. He let that sink in. End it now, you and me. Save your soldiers from dying for a cause that was manufactured by traitors. Thrace's expression flickered because he'd been wondering about that, about why the northern territories had suddenly decided this woman was worth rebellion, about who'd been feeding them information, about whether he was being used. The general looked at his army, then at the royal forces holding the pass, then back at Lucien. Single combat. To first blood or surrender? To death. Lucien's voice went hard. No half measures. We end this completely. Understanding what Lucien was doing requires grasping the weight of this offer. He was gambling everything on his own skill, risking not just his life, but Evelyne's, the Empire's future, everything he'd fought to protect. And he was doing it not because he thought he'd win easily, but because he understood something about leadership that separated him from ordinary rulers. That sometimes the only way to save people from themselves is to shoulder the entire burden personally, to transform a war that would kill thousands into a duel that would kill at most one. That's the loneliness of command, the willingness to die alone so others don't have to die together. General Thrace drew his sword. Agreed. The two armies formed a circle, thousands of soldiers creating an arena in the mountain pass, royal forces on one side, northern troops on the other, all of them watching two men prepare to decide their fate. Evelyne stood at the edge of the royal formation with her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. She wanted to scream, to run into the circle and drag Lucien back, to do anything except watch this happen. But she forced herself to stay still, because this was his choice, his decision, and respecting him meant letting him make it even when it terrified her. The two commanders faced each other in the center of the circle. General Thrace moved first. He was fast. Faster than a man his age should be. His sword came in high, then dropped low. Deceptive strike designed to draw the block up before sliding under. Lucien sidestepped instead of blocking. Let the blade pass. Countered with a strike at Thrace's exposed side. The general twisted. Caught the blow on his armor. Sparks flew. They separated. Circled. Both assessing. Thrace attacked again. This time a combination. High, low, high. Forcing Lucien to defend, driving him backward toward the edge of the circle. The northern army cheered. Lucien let himself be pushed, then planted his foot and exploded forward. His shoulder slammed into Thrace's chest. The impact sent the general staggering. Lucien's sword came down in an arc meant to split skull. Thrace rolled, came up with his blade already moving, caught Lucien across the thigh. Blood flowed. First blood to the northerner. The cheering intensified. Evelyne felt her heart stop. But Lucien barely reacted to the wound, just shifted his stance slightly, compensated for the injury, kept moving. The fight intensified. Both men fighting with everything they had. Decades of experience and training colliding. Steel screaming against steel, blood falling on stone. Two killers who'd survived countless battles trying to end one more. They fought for 5 minutes that felt like hours, neither giving ground, neither showing weakness. Then Lucien saw the opening. Thrace's guard dropped a fraction of an inch. Exhaustion, or age, or just bad timing. The king's sword moved like striking lightning, caught the general across the throat. Not deep, but deep enough. Blood sprayed. General Thrace dropped to his knees. His sword fell from nerveless fingers. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. Then he fell forward, dead before he hit the ground. The mountain pass went absolutely silent. King Lucien stood over his opponent's body, breathing hard. Blood ran down his leg from the thigh wound. More blood covered his armor from a dozen minor cuts. But he was standing, victorious. He raised his voice to carry across both armies. The challenge is satisfied. By the terms agreed, the northern forces will withdraw. This war is over. For a moment, nothing happened. 15,000 northern soldiers staring at their dead commander, trying to process what came next. Then one of them dropped his weapon. Then another. Then entire formations laying down arms in surrender. Because without Thrace, they had no leader. No reason to keep fighting, just a manufactured cause that had gotten their general killed. The royal army didn't cheer, didn't celebrate, just watched in exhausted relief as their enemies surrendered. Evelyne ran into the circle. Didn't care about protocol or propriety or anything except reaching Lucien before he collapsed. She caught him as his legs gave out, held him upright through sheer will. "You're hurt. I'll live." His voice was rough. "We won. You won." She was crying without realizing it. "You insane, terrifying, beautiful man. You won." Guards surrounded them. Medics rushed forward. General Kastov was shouting orders about accepting surrender and securing weapons and treating wounded. But Evelyne only saw Lucien, alive, victorious, hers. He cupped her face with blood-stained hands. "Told you I'd come back." She kissed him there in the center of the battlefield, surrounded by death and victory and the remains of a war that had almost destroyed them both. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Evelyne felt something besides fear. Hope. Real hope that maybe they'd actually survived this. That maybe choosing each other hadn't been a beautiful mistake. That maybe an empire could be built on something besides cruelty. The Northern Army withdrew over the next hour, 15,000 soldiers marching back toward their territories in defeat. They'd lost their commander, lost their cause, lost their certainty that the crown was weak. The royal forces held the passes and started the grim work of collecting their dead. 400 soldiers who'd died defending a king's right to choose humanity. 400 names that would be remembered, honored, written into history as the price of transformation. And as the sun set over the Grey March Mountains, King Lucien Veydrake stood beside Evelyne Rowe and watched an empire begin changing into something neither of them fully understood yet. Something built on the radical idea that survival mattered more than privilege, that choosing humanity wasn't weakness, that love could be worth fighting for even when fighting meant risking everything. The war was over, but the real work of building something better from the ashes was just beginning. The journey back to the capital took 4 days, not because of distance, but because they moved slowly, carrying wounded, honoring dead, letting soldiers process what they'd survived and what they'd lost. An army that had marched north in grim determination returned south in exhausted silence. Victory didn't feel like the songs claimed it should. It felt like surviving something that had tried to destroy you, and realizing you'd never be the same person again. King Lucien rode at the front with his thigh bandaged and his armor still stained with blood. Nobody had bothered cleaning. He looked older, harder, like something inside him had calcified during that duel with General Thrace. Evelyne rode beside him wearing armor that had saved her life 3 times during the battle. She'd killed 4 men, maybe 5. The memories blurred together into images of steel and blood and faces that would haunt her sleep for years. She wasn't a ghost anymore. Ghosts didn't kill people. They barely spoke during the journey, just existed side by side in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd walked through hell holding hands and somehow made it out the other side. Understanding what happens after victory requires grasping something fundamental about trauma and transformation. Winning doesn't erase what you went through to win. It doesn't restore innocence or undo damage. It just means you survived long enough to face the consequences of your choices, to look at what you became in order to protect what mattered, and decide whether that transformation was worth the cost. That's the real test. Not the battle itself, but the aftermath. When adrenaline fades, and you're left alone with the person you've become. The capital appeared on the horizon at sunset on the 4th day, black marble towers catching dying light, the palace walls carved with victories of dead kings, the city that had rejected Evelyne, called her worthless, tried to have her killed, the city they'd fought a war to keep from dictating their worth. Citizens lined the streets as the army entered, thousands of people watching the soldiers return. Their expressions were complicated, relief that the war was over, grief for those who hadn't come back, uncertainty about what came next, because the empire had fundamentally changed during those 4 days. A king had chosen love over political convenience, had killed a renowned general in single combat to defend that choice, had proven that caring about someone the world called disposable was worth more than maintaining traditions built on cruelty. That terrified people as much as it inspired them. The procession reached the palace as night fell. Lucien dismounted stiffly, his wounded leg making movement difficult. Guards rushed forward, but he waved them off. "Get the wounded to the medical wings. Make sure every soldier who fought gets triple wages and a week of rest." He looked at General Kastov. "I want the families of the fallen contacted personally, full pensions, land grants. Their sacrifice gets honored properly." The general nodded and started issuing orders. Lucien turned to Evelyne. "We need to finish this." She understood what he meant immediately. The traitors, the nobles who'd financed the rebellion, the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both. Time to cut out the rot completely. What? They assembled the remaining court in the throne room at midnight. Every noble family that had stayed loyal, every council member who hadn't fled or been arrested, every person who'd chosen to remain with the crown through civil war and uncertainty. Maybe 200 people where once there had been thousands. The empire had shed population like a snake shedding skin. And what remained was harder, leaner, more willing to embrace change because clinging to tradition had nearly killed them. King Lucien entered wearing simple black clothing instead of ceremonial armor. No crown, no symbols of office. Just a man who'd killed to protect what he loved and was now facing the consequences. Evelyne walked beside him wearing a dress the color of storm clouds. Her hair was down. Her hands were steady. She looked like someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing. They took their positions at the front of the chamber. Lucien's voice carried through the space with quiet authority. Lord Veydrake confessed to everything before he died. The names of every noble who financed the rebellion, every merchant who supplied them, every official who looked the other way. He gestured, and guards brought forward scrolls, lists of names, evidence compiled over days of interrogation. 147 people conspired to destabilize this empire, to force my hand, to prove that choosing humanity over hierarchy was weakness that could be exploited. The assembled court held its breath. They were wrong. Lucien's golden eyes swept across them. Caring about someone isn't weakness. It's the only thing that gives power meaning. Without something worth protecting, strength is just violence waiting for an excuse. He paused. But they did succeed in one thing. They proved this empire was rotting from the inside. That we'd built a system where survival of cruelty made people disposable, where privilege mattered more than character, where value was determined by accidents of birth instead of choices made under pressure. His expression hardened. That empire is dead. I killed it in those mountain passes. What we build from here will be different. The chamber erupted in whispers. Because this wasn't a speech about punishing traitors. This was a declaration of fundamental change. A king announcing he was dismantling the structures that had kept his empire functioning for generations. Lady Thorne stood from her seat. Your Majesty, with respect, you can't simply tear down centuries of tradition because one woman— Her name is Evelyne. Lucien cut her off. Use it. She's not one woman. She's the symbol of everyone this empire discarded. Everyone who survived suffering and came out the other side still capable of kindness. He moved down from the platform. And if honoring her means dismantling traditions built on treating people like resources, then yes, I'm tearing it all down. Every law that values breeding over character, every custom that treats survival as shame, every structure that protects cruelty by calling it natural order. The words landed like hammer blows. This is the moment where philosophy becomes policy, where abstract principles about human value transform into concrete changes that affect thousands of lives. It's easy to talk about caring when it costs nothing. The test comes when caring requires destroying systems that benefit you, when choosing humanity means losing privilege. That's where most rulers fail. They make speeches about justice while maintaining structures that depend on injustice. Lucien was different. He'd already proven he'd burn the empire rather than compromise. Now he was offering to rebuild it into something better. Lord Marston stood carefully. Your Majesty, what exactly are you proposing? Lucien looked at Evelyne. She'd helped him draft these changes during the journey back, turned his rage into policy, his devotion into structure. First, he began, labor camps are abolished empire-wide. Debt can no longer be settled through forced servitude. Anyone currently imprisoned for their family's financial obligations will be released and their debts forgiven. Gasps swept through the court. Second, inheritance law changes. Noble titles can still pass through bloodlines, but they no longer grant automatic authority. All positions of power require proving competence through examination and service. More shock. Third, the royal court opens to anyone who demonstrates capability regardless of birth. Evelyne oversees the selection process. If she survived what she survived and still maintained her humanity, she understands what real strength looks like better than anyone in this room. He looked at his assembled nobility with an expression that dared them to object. These changes take effect immediately. Anyone who can't accept them can leave, peacefully. I'll even provide transportation, but if you stay, you accept that this empire values survival over privilege, character over breeding, humanity over tradition. The silence that followed was absolute, because he'd just gutted the foundations of aristocratic power, told nobility that their births no longer guaranteed them anything, that they'd have to earn their positions alongside people they'd spent centuries calling inferior. Some would leave, maybe many, but those who stayed would build something different, something that didn't require discarding broken people to function. Evelyne stepped forward, her voice carried through the chamber. I know what you're thinking, that the king has lost his mind, that loving someone like me has made him weak, that these changes will destroy the empire's strength. She looked at faces ranging from hostile to uncertain to cautiously hopeful. But here's what I learned in the labor camps. In the places where this empire sends people, it considers disposable. Strength isn't about dominance, it's about endurance, about surviving things designed to break you and choosing kindness anyway. Her hands were steady. The empire you built was strong in the ways that don't matter. Military conquest, political control, the ability to crush anyone who challenged your authority. But it was weak where it counted. In humanity, in recognizing that people who suffer aren't automatically worthless, in understanding that survival proves strength instead of disqualifying it. She moved to stand beside Lucien. You're terrified because you built your entire identity on being better than people like me, on believing your births made you valuable and our suffering made us disposable. And now your king is telling you that was a lie, that I matter as much as you do, that character counts more than bloodline. Her voice hardened. So, yes, be terrified. Because the world where you could discard people without consequence is ending, and what comes next requires you to earn your value instead of inheriting it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for the old order. Then something unexpected happened. A young noble near the back stood. Then another. Then a dozen more. They weren't leaving. They were acknowledging her, accepting the challenge, choosing to stay and build something different instead of clinging to traditions that had nearly destroyed them all. Not everyone stood. Maybe half the room remained seated, faces hard with rejection, but half was enough. King Lucien looked at those who'd stood with an expression that almost resembled hope. To those who are staying, welcome to the harder path, building an empire on humanity instead of hierarchy, on earned respect instead of inherited privilege, on the radical idea that people who survive hell are stronger than people who've never been tested. He paused. To those who are leaving, you have 3 days. Collect your belongings, say your goodbyes, depart peacefully. There will be no punishment, no retribution, just separation. The court slowly emptied, some nobles walking toward the exit immediately, others lingering, trying to decide which future they wanted. Within an hour, only 50 people remained, 50 out of the hundreds who'd filled the court before the rebellion. But those 50 looked at Lucien and Evelyne with something the others never had. Respect earned through shared trial instead of demanded through fear. That was worth more than any number of reluctant followers. The palace transformed over the following weeks. Nobles who'd chosen to leave departed with their families and whatever wealth they could carry. Their estates were redistributed, given to soldiers who'd fought in the mountain passes, to families who'd lost members in the attacks, to people the old empire would have called unworthy. The Eastern Greenhouse became the center of a new program. Evelyne trained former labor camp survivors in medicinal plant cultivation, gave them skills, purpose, value, turned damage into expertise. The council reorganized around competence instead of bloodline. General Kastov remained because he'd proven his loyalty and capability. Lady Thorne left because she couldn't accept serving beside people she considered beneath her station. New faces appeared in the palace corridors, people who'd survived things the old nobility couldn't imagine, who brought perspectives that had never been considered worth hearing. The empire slowly rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable, and through it all, Lucien and Evelyne existed at the center of the transformation, like two pillars holding up a structure that wanted to collapse back into familiar patterns. Understanding what they'd created requires grasping the difference between revolution and evolution. Revolution destroys everything and starts fresh. Evolution keeps what works and discards what doesn't. They weren't trying to eliminate nobility or dismantle all hierarchy, just to change what hierarchy measured, to value survival and character alongside birth and wealth, to create space for people the old system would have thrown away. That's harder than revolution. It requires constant negotiation between past and future, constant resistance to falling back into comfortable cruelty. 3 months after the battle, Evelyne found Lucien in his study, staring at reports from the Northern Territories. They're asking to rejoin the Empire. His voice carried exhaustion. The territories that rebelled. They've seen the changes, heard about the labor camp abolition, want to be part of what we're building instead of standing against it. That's good, isn't it? That's good, isn't, maybe? He set down the correspondence. Or maybe they're just opportunistic, waiting to see if this experiment fails so they can say they were always skeptical. She moved behind him, started massaging the tension from his shoulders. You can't control what they think, only what you do. And what you've done is give people who are disposable a chance to matter. That's not nothing. It cost 400 soldiers and saved thousands who would have died in labor camps, who would have been trafficked, who would have been discarded. She leaned down and kissed the top of his head. The math is horrible, but it still works in humanity's favor. Lucien pulled her around to sit in his lap. His golden eyes were tired but clear. Do you regret it? Any of it? The war, the changes, everything that happened because I chose you? Evelyne thought about the question seriously, about the men she'd killed, the nightmares she carried, the weight of knowing people had died partly because she existed. No, she said finally. I regret that it was necessary, that the Empire was built so badly that tearing it down cost lives. But I don't regret surviving. Don't regret you choosing me. Don't regret fighting back instead of disappearing. She touched his face gently. For the first time in my life, I matter because of who I am instead of who noticed me. That's worth every terrible thing it took to get here. Even the nightmares? Even those. Because nightmares mean I survived long enough to have them. She smiled. People who die don't get haunted. Only survivors carry ghosts. The observation was darker than she'd intended, but Lucien understood, because he carried ghosts too. 400 soldiers, General Thrace, every person who died in that mountain pass. They followed him through palace corridors, whispered during sleepless nights, reminded him that power had costs measured in lives. This is the burden true leaders carry, not the weight of victory, but the weight of what victory required. Every choice that saved some people meant abandoning others. Every policy that helped thousands hurt dozens. Leadership meant accepting that you'd never get it perfectly right, that you'd carry guilt for necessary cruelties the rest of your life. The test wasn't avoiding that weight. It was carrying it without letting it crush your capacity for continued humanity. I'm tired, Lucien admitted quietly, of fighting, of justifying, of trying to build something better while half the Empire waits for it to fail. Then rest. She wrapped her arms around him. You don't have to fix everything tonight, or this week, or even this year. Just keep moving forward. Keep choosing humanity even when it's harder. That's enough. Is it though? Yes, because eventually enough people will see it working and join in. And the ones who don't will age out and die, and their children will inherit an empire where value comes from character instead of birth, where survival of suffering proves strength instead of disqualifying it. She pulled back to look at him. You're planting seeds, Lucien. Not harvesting crops. The real results won't show for decades, but they'll show. And people will forget there was ever a time when someone like me was considered worthless. The words settled something inside him that had been fraying. Because she was right. He was building infrastructure for a future he'd never fully see, creating systems that would outlast him. That was the real measure of leadership. Not immediate results, but long-term transformation. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, trying to communicate everything words couldn't carry. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Marry me, he said. The words hung in the air between them. Evelyne's eyes went wide. What? Marry me? Not because the Empire expects it, not to legitimize anything or satisfy political requirements. Just because I want to spend whatever time I have left standing beside you, building this impossible thing together. His hands framed her face. You've already survived hell and come out stronger. Already fought beside me. Already proven you can handle everything this position demands. So marry me. Let me call you my queen, not just because I decree it, but because you choose to stand beside me anyway. Evelyne felt tears burning, because 3 months ago she'd been a ghost, invisible, discarded, worthless in every way the Empire measured value, and now the most powerful man alive was asking her to stand beside him as an equal, not despite her scars, but because of everything those scars represented about her capacity to endure. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. The marriage, the impossible building, the decades of fighting to make this empire value humanity. Yes. He kissed her again, and this time it felt like a promise, like two broken things deciding they were stronger together than apart, like the beginning of something that had been forged in fire and blood and desperation, like hope made tangible. The coronation happened 6 weeks later. Not a traditional ceremony with priests and nobles and endless pageantry. Something simpler, more honest. A gathering in the palace courtyard open to anyone who wanted to attend. Thousands came. Former labor camp survivors, soldiers who'd fought in the mountain passes, families who'd lost members but chose to believe in what was being built instead of drowning in grief. Merchants and craftspeople and farmers, and everyone the old empire had considered beneath notice. They filled the courtyard and spilled into surrounding streets, waiting to see a ghost become a queen. Evelyne stood on the platform wearing a dress that merged midnight blue with deep crimson, colors of storm and blood. Of everything she'd survived, her hair was down, her scars were visible. She wore no jewelry except a single ring Lucien had given her, simple silver without gems or ornamentation, a symbol that value came from meaning instead of cost. King Lucien placed the crown on her head himself, not the heavy, ornate thing previous queens had worn, something lighter. Steel worked with silver, practical and beautiful, a crown for someone who'd fought beside armies instead of watching from safety. When he stepped back, she looked different, not because the crown changed her, because she'd finally stopped believing she didn't deserve to wear it. That internal transformation was worth more than any external symbol. Lucien addressed the crowd. This woman survived things that would have destroyed anyone in the old court. Labor camps, trafficking, abuse, every form of cruelty the empire could inflict on someone it considered disposable. His voice carried across the courtyard. She came out the other side still kind, still capable of caring about people who couldn't offer her anything, still willing to stand in fire beside soldiers fighting for change instead of hiding in safety. He looked at her with unconcealed devotion. That makes her stronger than anyone who ever wore this crown before her, and it makes this empire better for having her lead it beside me. The crowd erupted. Not polite applause, real cheering, thousands of voices raised in support of someone who represented their own survival, their own refusal to be discarded. Evelyne looked out at them and felt something break inside her chest, not in a bad way, just the final shattering of the belief that she was worthless, that suffering had ruined her beyond repair, that she'd always be the ghost girl nobody remembered. She was real now, undeniably, irrevocably, real. When the cheering finally died down, she spoke. I'm not going to pretend this is easy. Building an empire that values humanity takes work. It means dismantling systems that benefit some people. It means giving voice to perspectives that make others uncomfortable. It means accepting that worth comes from character instead of circumstance. Her voice stayed steady. Some of you will hate this. Will fight it. Will long for the old ways where your births guaranteed your value and others' suffering proved their disposability. She looked at the faces in the crowd, some supportive, some uncertain, some openly hostile. To those people I say this, you're welcome to leave, peacefully, without retribution. But if you stay, you accept that this empire measures people by what they've overcome instead of what they've inherited, by how they treat those with less power instead of how they perform for those with more. She paused. And to everyone who survived being discarded, I say this: you matter. Your suffering doesn't disqualify you. Your scars prove your strength, and anyone who treats you as disposable will answer to me personally. The words were a vow and a threat and a promise all wrapped together. The crowd's response was deafening, because she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone the old empire had thrown away, everyone who'd survived by being invisible, everyone who'd learned that staying quiet kept you alive. She was telling them it was safe to exist loudly now, that survival deserved celebration instead of shame, that they'd built something worth protecting together. This is the moment where individual transformation becomes collective movement, where one person's refusal to accept their assigned worthlessness inspires thousands to question their own, where personal liberation becomes political revolution not through violence but through visibility, by refusing to hide, by demanding to be seen as human instead of acceptable to disappear. That's how empires actually change. Not through military conquest, but through fundamental shifts in who gets counted as mattering. The ceremony concluded with Lucien, Ian, and Evelyne walking through the crowd together, not above it, not protected from it, through it, touching hands, meeting eyes, connecting with the people who'd chosen to believe in this impossible experiment. And everywhere they went, people reached out, not to take, just to touch, to make contact with something they'd been told was impossible, a king who chose humanity, a queen who survived being discarded, together building an empire that measured worth differently. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't ever be perfect. There would be setbacks and resistance and people who rejected the changes entirely. But it was better than what came before, and better was worth fighting for. 5 years later, Evelyne stood in the eastern greenhouse surrounded by plants that healed instead of hurt. The space had expanded dramatically. Now it employed 200 people, mostly former labor camp survivors trained in medicinal cultivation, creating value from experiences the old empire would have called disqualifying. She moved through the rows, checking growth patterns, making notes, planning next season's cultivation. Her hands were dirty, her dress was simple. She looked nothing like traditional queens, but the empire had stopped expecting her to, because in 5 years, the changes had taken root deeper than anyone expected. Labor camp abolition had freed thousands. Many struggled reintegrating, some thrived. All had opportunities the old system never would have offered. The competency examinations for positions of power had shifted the court's composition entirely. Now it included former servants, merchants, soldiers, people from backgrounds that would have disqualified them automatically before. Noble families who'd stayed adapted. Those who left were slowly being forgotten, their estates redistributed, their names becoming historical footnotes instead of current power. The Northern Territories had rejoined and were implementing similar reforms. Other kingdoms were watching, some with interest, others with horror, but watching nonetheless. Change spread slowly, but it spread. Lucien found her there among the growing things as afternoon light filtered through glass walls. He looked older. Gray touched his temples. Lines marked his face. 5 years of rebuilding an empire had worn him down in visible ways. But he also looked lighter. Like burdens he'd carried for decades had finally eased. The council wants to discuss expansion into the Western Territories, he said without preamble. They're proposing we offer our labor reform model as incentive for peaceful integration. What do you think? I think I'm tired of conquest. But if we can spread these changes without bloodshed, maybe it's worth considering. She set down her notes and moved to him, reached up to trace the new lines around his eyes. You look exhausted. I am exhausted. Running an empire is easier when you just crush anyone who disagrees. Trying to build consensus while maintaining principles is significantly harder. But worth it? He pulled her close. Yes, worth it. Every frustrating negotiation, every compromise that takes months instead of minutes, every moment where I question whether any of this is working. His hand settled on her waist. Because I look at you standing here training people the old empire would have discarded, creating value from survival, and I know we built something that matters. She smiled against his chest. We're not done building yet. No. But we're further along than I thought we'd get. And that's enough for now. They stood together in the greenhouse while light faded and evening approached. Two people who'd survived impossible odds, who'd chosen each other when choosing meant risking everything, who'd transformed personal survival into collective liberation. Understanding what they'd accomplished requires stepping back from individual moments to see the larger pattern. They hadn't created perfection, hadn't eliminated suffering, or solved every problem. but they'd fundamentally altered what the empire valued, shifted the measurement from privilege to character, from birth to survival, from dominance to humanity. That change would outlast them both, would ripple through generations, would slowly transform the world into something that didn't require discarding broken people to function. That was the real victory. Not the battle in the mountain passes, but the quiet daily work of rebuilding systems to measure worth differently. Evelyne thought about the girl she'd been 5 years ago. Invisible. Terrified. Convinced she was worthless because the world had spent years teaching her that lesson. That girl was gone. Not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into someone who understood that survival proved strength instead of disqualifying it. That scars were evidence of endurance rather than marks of shame. That being chosen by someone powerful mattered less than choosing herself first. She'd become someone who could stand in fire without burning, who could face an empire's rejection and decide the empire was wrong instead of her, who could look at privilege and refuse to be impressed by anything except character tested under pressure. That transformation was worth every nightmare, every moment of doubt, every terrifying choice. Lucien kissed the top of her head. We should go. Council meeting in an hour and Kastov gets irritable when we're late. Let him wait. She pulled back to look at him. This is important too. Standing here, remembering why we're doing any of this, what we're protecting. He smiled. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between killing 4 men in a mountain pass and learning that queens can still have dirt under their fingernails? The observation made him laugh. Real laughter that transformed his entire face from stone into something human. They walked back toward the palace together as stars began appearing overhead. Through corridors that had once terrified her. Past guards who nodded respectfully instead of looking through her. Into rooms where her voice mattered as much as anyone's. The empire had changed. Or maybe just revealed what it could have been all along if anyone had bothered valuing humanity over hierarchy. Either way, it was better. Not perfect. Not finished. Just better. And better was worth everything they'd sacrificed to build it. 10 years after the coronation, King Lucien Veydrake died peacefully in his sleep. Not from battle. Not from assassination. Just age and exhaustion and a body that had been pushed too hard for too long finally giving out. Evelyne found him in the morning, still warm but already gone. His face was peaceful, like he'd finally set down burdens he'd carried since childhood. She didn't cry immediately, just sat beside him holding his hand while dawn light filtered through windows, remembering everything they'd built, everything they'd survived, everything they'd transformed together. The funeral drew thousands. People traveled from across the empire and beyond to honor the king who'd chosen humanity over tradition, who'd fought a war to defend his right to value someone the world called worthless, who'd spent his final years rebuilding power structures to measure worth by character instead of birth. They called him the Iron King who learned to care. The ruler who proved strength and gentleness weren't mutually exclusive. The Alpha who transformed his empire by refusing to discard broken things. Evelyne stood at his funeral wearing black and silver, the crown he'd placed on her head a decade ago. Her face was composed, her grief was private, but when she spoke, her voice carried across the assembled thousands. Lucien Veydrake was many things: conqueror, king, warrior, leader. But what I'll remember most is that he was human, completely, courageously, human. She looked at the faces watching her. Some she recognized from the early days. Others were new, younger, products of the empire they'd built. He wasn't perfect, made mistakes, carried guilt for necessary cruelties, struggled with the weight of choices that had no right answers. Her voice strengthened. But he never stopped trying to do better. Never stopped choosing humanity even when hierarchy was easier. Never stopped believing that people who survived suffering were stronger than people who'd never been tested. She touched the crown on her head. He taught me that worth comes from what you overcome instead of what you inherit. That survival proves strength instead of disqualifying it. That loving someone means protecting them even when protection costs everything. Tears finally fell, but her voice stayed steady. And he taught this empire that caring isn't weakness, that building something on humanity instead of cruelty is harder but worth the difficulty, that transformation requires courage to keep choosing right over easy. She looked at his body laid out in state. So I make this vow. I will continue what we started. We'll keep building an empire that values character over circumstance. We'll fight to ensure that what we created outlasts us both." Her hand touched her chest where her heart was breaking, because that's what love demands. Not eternal presence, but eternal influence. Not avoiding death, but making sure what you built survives it. The words hung in the air like a promise and a prayer. The empire mourned for a week, then slowly returned to the work of living, of continuing the transformation Lucien and Evelyne had started. Because that's what happens after great leaders die. Their vision either dies with them or gets carried forward by people who believed in what they built. This vision survived. What? 20 years after Lucien's death, Queen Evelyne stood in the throne room addressing the empire one final time. She'd ruled alone for 2 decades, continued implementing reforms, spread the labor abolition model to neighboring kingdoms, created systems that valued survival and character alongside birth and wealth. The empire looked completely different than it had 40 years ago, unrecognizable in the best possible ways. She was 70 now, gray-haired, scarred, wearing age like proof of survival instead of decline. The council had tried to convince her to remarry, to produce heirs, to secure the succession in traditional ways. She'd refused. Because this empire no longer measured legitimacy through bloodlines. It measured capability through competency exams and demonstrated service. Whoever succeeded her would earn the position instead of inheriting it. That was the point. She looked at the assembled court. Most faces were unfamiliar now. A new generation that had grown up in an empire that valued different things. They didn't remember when labor camps existed, when survival of suffering disqualified people, when someone like Evelyne would have been thrown away without thought. They'd inherited something better, and most didn't realize how hard won it was. "I'm stepping down," she said simply. "Effective immediately. The succession exam will determine my replacement. Anyone who meets the competency requirements can apply regardless of birth or background." Shock rippled through the court, because queens didn't abdicate, didn't voluntarily give up power. That violated every tradition about how monarchy functioned. But Evelyne had spent 40 years proving that traditions could change. "I've done what I came to do. Built systems that value humanity, created infrastructure that outlasts individual rulers, transformed an empire that discarded broken people into one that recognizes survival as strength." She removed the crown slowly, set it on the throne. What comes next belongs to people who inherited this world instead of having to fight to create it, who can build on foundations we laid without carrying the trauma we survived to lay them. Her voice softened. "Lucien and I were broken things who found each other in the dark and decided broken could still be beautiful, still be strong, still be worth protecting. We built this empire on that belief, on the radical idea that worth comes from character instead of circumstance." She looked at the young faces watching her with varying expressions of shock and understanding. "Don't forget that. Don't let this empire slide back into measuring people by what they inherit instead of what they overcome. Don't discard survivors. Don't worship privilege. Don't mistake suffering for weakness." Her final words carried the weight of everything she'd lived through. Because the moment you start throwing people away is the moment you become what we fought to transform. Then she walked out of the throne room, not as queen, just as Evelyne. A woman who'd survived hell and used that survival to build something better, who'd been chosen by a king and learned to choose herself, who'd proven that broken things could be strong and gentle simultaneously, who'd changed an empire by refusing to accept she was worthless. She died 3 years later, quietly, surrounded by people she'd trained in the greenhouse. Her body gave out the same way Lucien's had, just wore down from decades of carrying weight most people couldn't imagine. They buried her beside him in the palace gardens. 2 headstones marking 2 people who'd transformed the world by choosing humanity when cruelty was easier. The empire mourned, then continued the work they'd started, because that's the real measure of legacy. Not how much you're mourned, but how long your vision survives your death. This one survived. 40 years became 80, became 100, became the foundation empires across the continent built on. The idea that survival proved strength, that character mattered more than birth, that people who endured suffering were valuable instead of disposable. It started with one king noticing one servant girl, with choosing humanity over politics, with believing broken things could still be beautiful. And it changed everything. Not overnight, not perfectly, but fundamentally, irreversibly. The Empire of Dravenmoor became known for something unexpected. Not military conquest, not wealth, not dominance. For being the place where discarded people discovered they weren't worthless after all. Where ghosts became queens. Where love mattered more than tradition. Where two broken souls had proven that surviving made you stronger than never being tested. And that legacy outlasted every king who'd come before. Every tradition built on cruelty. Every system that measured worth by privilege instead of character. Because in the end, the most powerful thing anyone can do isn't conquer territories or crush enemies. It's look at someone the world calls worthless and prove the world wrong. That's what Lucien and Evelyne did. Not because they were perfect, because they were human enough to care when caring cost everything. And that made all the difference.